Um, Thank you, Zoe. I'm sure there'll be people continuing to join for the next few minutes, but we will start with a welcome from Russell Hobson. So it's great that Russell can join us this morning. Russell is our Director of Business and Research at Butterfly Conservation. Over to you, Russell.
Thanks very much, Richard, and good morning, everyone. And as Richard says, welcome to the 2025 UK Moth Recorders Meeting. After the pleasure of seeing many people last year at our face-to-face meeting, we're reverting to an online meeting this year. And in terms of the likely travel disruption there would have been, it's turned out to be quite a good thing. But we do understand your enthusiasm for those face-to-face meetings, and we are looking at how we fund those in future. We do want to see them continuing in some format or other. Because, to be frank, as BC staff, we value meeting all of you in person as much as you enjoy meeting other enthusiasts. So please watch this space. Um, we had some great presentations last year. I particularly enjoyed the interactive presentation by our very own Patrick Cook, and these are all still available to view on YouTube. So if you missed last year's at all, please do go and have a look. And that is one of the advantages of having online talks, is that people from around the UK and overseas can contribute and view what we're doing. And I did see Monica in Croatia has joined us for this morning, so welcome to you. I think I have to start this introduction really with a fond farewell to Les Hill, who, after 18 years with Butterfly Conservation, has decided to retire. Um, During his time, he established the Moth database, was part of the Moth Atlas team, facilitated the NBN Atlas data share, and provided technical tools and support for county moth recorders. So we are really going to miss his knowledge and his understanding. And clearly that work needs to continue, and we will be going out to recruit a replacement for Les in the coming months. So in the meantime, we're going to continue to accept locally verified data sets and store them securely. And of course, there'll be a period of catching up, and for whoever is new into the post, getting to know the network. So bear with us while that happens. But in the meantime, just a big thank you to Les for all that you've done to foster and support moth recording in the last 18 years. And also, the last year hasn't been a quiet time. We haven't been sitting back on our laurels after the supporting science project ended. So I know there's been lots of development work going on. Zoe's been working to reinvigorate the volunteer panel approach for micromoth verification. And we now have experts in each region and at UK level to help with those tricky identification cases for micromoths. And we're excited about this supporting data flow and learning about micromoths in the months and years ahead. The verification network has grown with 18 new verifiers joining last year. Verification assistants are helping county recorders share the workload and bringing their time and skills to the task of checking records. And we're also pleased to now provide online training rather, uh, uh, on verification through the iRecord system to new volunteers. And that complements the mentoring offered by experienced county recorders to new verifiers. And on the subject of online training, I've got to thank everyone that's signed up to the new volunteer portal Assemble. This is a system designed to support all of Butterfly Conservation's volunteers, whether members or not, and people can continue signing up at any time. But this year, we're also moving on to a new stage of developing that portal in terms of providing online access to training opportunities, as well as all of the online access to news and connecting you with other volunteers through messaging or fora. So if you're not registered, please email volunteering@butterflyconservation.org, and they can sort that out for you. My mothing highlights when I reviewed them this year have been quite modest. I think I was most excited to find vapora and early thorn larvae on a recently planted hedge in my wild space. And but I do realise that there's been lots of fascinating news from around the UK over the last year. And just looking back at December's EMOth and the monitoring at high altitudes for Mountain Burnett, and also the research on the acceleration of moth colonizers have provided some really interesting insights, as will today's speakers. And so I'm going to pass you back to Richard, and he will introduce an update on the National Moth Recording Scheme from Zoe. So over to you, Richard.
Thanks very much, Russell. That's great introduction and welcome. And yes, as you say, we're our next speaker, the traditional start to the Moth Recorders Meeting is an update on the National Moth Recording Scheme. And so that'll be Dr. Zoe Randle from Butterfly Conservation. Zoe, over to you.
Super, thank you. I'm just, Richard, I was sending you a direct message. Could you help David Hill? He can't get into the Zoom meeting.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay.
Help him. That would be great. Super, thank you. So, good morning, everybody. I'm Dr. Zoe Randle. I'm Senior Surveys Officer at Butterfly Conservation. And I'm going to give you an update on the National Moth Recording Scheme. So, hopefully you can all see my my presentation.
Yeah, that's great.
Superb, excellent, lovely. So, well, here we go then. So thank you for joining us this morning. I'm going to give you an update on the national scheme, as I said. So we'll start off with diving straight into the number of macro moth records in the National Moth Recording Scheme. So we've got a staggering 36.2 million macro moth records in the national scheme. They're all been verified with the county recorder network and the verification assistants supporting them. The graph here shows the number of records by year in the national scheme. So we start at 9, obviously the records go back to 1590, but for purposes of this graph, starting at 1988 and going up to 2023. And you can see here that from the early 2000s, there's been a real sort of increase in moth recording, showing that the number of records every year is increasing year on year, and moth recording is becoming more and more popular. So lots of work for the county recorders and their verification assistants to do there to verify the records. 2006 was a good year. We had lots of migrants in 2006, is why there's that sort of peak there. And it sort of looks like it tails off in 2023, but I'll tell you more about that shortly. We've got more data sets to import, so that will boost that figure. On average, we get about 1 million macro moth records submitted to the national scheme every year. So thank you all for your records. Looking at micro moth records, we've got a lot fewer, but let's not forget that micro moths are a lot trickier than the macro moths and not as popular to record, although the recording of micro moths is growing in popularity. So again, similar chart going back to 1988 up to 2022. And yeah, 7.4 million verified moth records. And again, you know, steady increase and then huge, and then it really sort of takes off from the year 2000. So and getting on top of the micro moths is, as Russell said, is something that we're really keen to do so that we can produce threat assessments and hopefully provisional distribution maps and everything like that. So as Russell alluded to, we recently lost Les due to retirement, but prior to his retirement, he was working really hard on importing data sets into the national scheme. So these pie charts here show the proportion of records for each year that have either not been received from the county recorders or we have received from the county recorders, but they're in our to-do list, they're pending, waiting to be imported. And then we've got the green bits of the pie chart which show where we've received the data and imported those data. So, you know, we're really almost there with the 2020 data. There's still work. The red areas show where there's county recorders have got work to do to submit records to us. And there's the blue parts of the charts which show where Butterfly Conservation have got work to do to get these data imported. But you can see that on the whole, we are catching up after a bit of a hiatus when Les's time was taken up by migrating the butterflies to the New Millennium data set. So that's where we are with macro moth data sets. Micro moth data sets, similar-ish picture there. So again, you know, areas for butterfly conservation to crack on and get the data imported, and also for county recorders to send data to us. And although we currently don't have a data officer, as Russell said, we will be recruiting for one. And so their first job will be to get on top of the backlog. So please do keep sending the records in. They're being stored securely, ready for Les's successor to pick up the challenge of importing all these lovely records. So these maps here show the geographical coverage of data in the National Moth Recording Scheme. So the map on the left shows the number of records per 10 kilometre square for macro moths. And as you can see there, we've got really good coverage, 99% coverage at 10 kilometre square resolution of Britain, Northern Ireland and the Isle of Man. And what you can see here is that record density is generally much greater in southern Britain. And as you move further north up country, the number of records per 10k square generally thins out. But that's because there's fewer moths as you move further north, and also fewer recorders moving further north as well. But fantastic coverage. So thanks again to everybody. The top 5 10 kilometre squares in terms of number of macro moth records are TL11, which is in Hertfordshire, with a staggering 364,524 records. Then we've got TA41 in South East Yorkshire, SU88 on the Bucks and Berkshire border, SV91 is down in the Scillies, and SU50 is in South Hampshire. So absolutely staggering numbers of records per 10 kilometre square there. Then when we look at the map on the right, shows density of micro moth records per 10 kilometre square. And again, a similar picture. The density of micro moth records is generally greater in southern Britain. And again, as you move further north, there's fewer records, but also there's fewer moths, and there's also fewer recorders further north as well. So we've got 92% coverage at 10 kilometre square resolution for micro moths in the National Moth Recording Scheme, which is fantastic. And again, the top 5 squares, we've got TA41 in South East Yorkshire. And it's really interesting because there's 4 times as many macro moth records in TA41 as there are micro moth records. And so we've got TA41 in South East Yorkshire, TM24 in East Suffolk with just over 72,500 micro moth records, SJ79 in South Lancashire, TL707 on the Beds Northampton Huntingdonshire border, and again SB91 in the Scilly Isles. So absolutely fantastic, really great stuff. Those of you with a eagle eye will notice that there's a bit of a hole there for Leicestershire. We do have micro moth records for Leicestershire. But this is down to us. It's our bad here. We've not imported those records yet. So we have got them. And the same goes for Roxburghshire as well up in Scotland. So that's this little patch here. But absolutely fantastic effort. And, we will be working on prioritising micro moth records and getting more and more of those in the national scheme so we can do more fantastic stuff with your records and your data. So thanks to everybody for contributing. So this slide looks really complicated, and you've seen it so many times before, but I think we're still not getting the message out there that the Indicia warehouse is like a big building, if you like. The Indicia warehouse is where all of the records that are entered into the different recording schemes go in. So all of butterfly conservation schemes on the left here link through to the indicia warehouse. And if you like, the easiest way to look at this is that each one of these schemes is a different doorway into the same data warehouse. So, and then we've got also records also come to the national scheme directly to county recorders, which is absolutely fabulous. And no record enters the National Moth Recording Scheme or Butterfly for the New Millennium Scheme unless it's come through the County Recorder Network. So these records have to be verified by the County Recorder Network. County recorders also have direct access to records in the indicia data warehouse, the iRecord platform, through the iRecord platform. And Butterfly Conservation does not automatically access or get records from the indicia warehouse in iRecord. They have to come through the County Recorder Network. So county recorders can access the data in iRecord in the indicia warehouse. They can verify the records in iRecord, and then they can download those verified records, incorporate them with the data that have been sent in through their local recorders directly, verify them all and send them up to the national scheme. So I just thought it was important to reiterate how the data flow works. So looking at the different windows into the indicia iRecord warehouse, there's lots of ways that you can record moths. There's the iRecord general website. There's the National Moth Recording Scheme online website. There's the iRecord app, the iRecord Moths form. Some people are importing their records directly into iRecord. There's iNaturalist, there's the iRecord Butterflies app. The UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme also includes day flying moths. And then there's various, so local environmental record centre surveys, activities and fire blitzes and everything. And I thought what was really interesting here was just to look at this and see, well, what routes are people generally using to submit their records? And it's the iRecord Moths form. So 27% of records moth records in iRecord come in via the iRecord Moths form, followed by iRecord General. So this will be people that are submitting their moth records along with records of other taxa. And then there's it's the various, so LERC surveys, activities and fire blitzes. And okay, so that's all the routes, all the different doorways into the warehouse. Then I thought I'd have a look at the status of moth records in iRecord and whether they're verified or not. There's just over 4 million moth records in iRecord. Over 600,000 were submitted for 2024, and we've had 625 records for 2025 so far. And looking at the status of these records in iRecord, 80% of them have been accepted. There's only 16% of unverified records, so they're pending verification, and only 3% of records have not been accepted, so they've been rejected because they're erroneous. So personally, I think that shows that the data quality in iRecord is very good, because 80% of those records have been accepted. That's not to say that they haven't been queried as part of the verification process, but I think 80% of records being accepted and only 3% of records being rejected because they're erroneous, I think that's, I think they're pretty good ratio there. So looking at verification of records, moth records in iRecord, the chart here shows the years, so 2017 up to 2024, shows the number of records in the blue bars, and then the pink line shows the percentage of records in iRecord that have been verified, and this is moth records. So you can see that the number of records doubles from 2019 to 2020. If you remember, 2020 is when we were all locked down due to COVID, and biological recording had a sort of reinvigoration and reawakening, and lots of people then started to submit their records through iRecord. And that increase has increased, that growth has steadily increased over the years. But I think what's really heartening is the fact that over 80% in general, over 80% of the records in iRecord are being verified, which is absolutely fantastic. So thank you to all the county recorders who are engaging with iRecord, and also to the verification assistants who have been recruited to the network to help county recorders with the verification in iRecord. It's an enormous task, and building up these teams is really helping support the county recorders with the increase in moth records that come through, and also with the workload. So when I reported on verification of moth records in iRecord a couple of years ago, we were around about the 70%, 70% mark. So it's great that we're in excess of 80%. Obviously, the pink line there, it drops off from 2023 to 2024. But that's because winter time is traditionally the time of year when county recorders are busy verifying records. So they will be busy verifying records as we speak. And I'm quite sure that next year, when I show this chart, that pink line will be up in the 80% region. So again, thanks ever so much to everybody. And now let's have a lovely photograph of a moth. So here's a grey alder leaf miner by Patrick Clement, one of the micro moths. So, as Russell said, we're changing track a little bit here. Many of you will be new to mothing and moth recording, new to the National Moth Recording Scheme. And with Les's departure, I thought it would be a really lovely thing to show what we've achieved in 18 years of the National Moth Recording Scheme. I know it's not a fabulous, 20-year or 25-year anniversary, but 18 years is pretty good. We all came in on a 4-year contract when the National Moth Recording Scheme and the Moths Count project started, and I'm still here after nearly 18 years, and Les did his 18-year stint. So I thought it'd be nice to have a little look back and see what we've achieved. So obviously the Moths Count project was launched in May 2007 up in London, and we had Sir David Attenborough there launching the scheme with us. And he said to me, "Are you a lepidopterist?" And I said, "Yes, I suppose I am." And he signed my book Life in the Undergrowth for me, which is fabulous. So there's the project team on the left-hand side there. So that was May 2007. In December 2007, we imported the very first data set into the National Moth Recording Scheme, something like 170,000 records for Hertfordshire. And that was it. That was, the national scheme was onwards and upwards. And as time went on, all of those little vice counties you can see on that map there suddenly got coloured in, and we have lots and lots of data. There were a few changes to the Moths Count team and the National Moth Recording Scheme team over the years, and it's the team there on the right hand side there. That was the team in June 2009. One of the major outputs of the National Moth Recording Scheme was to produce a provisional atlas of the UK's larger moths before the Heritage Lottery funding ran out. So in 2010, we published the provisional atlas of the UK's larger moths, and that included 11.3 million macro moths. Then in 2021, we published the State of Britain's Larger Moths, and for the first time, moth distribution trends were included in the report, and there were 24 million macro moth records that went into the State of report. In November 2019, the atlas, the big main atlas of Britain and Ireland's larger moths was published, and that included 25.6 million macro moth records from the National Moth Recording Scheme and the Moths Ireland data set as well. And this is a landmark publication which included all of the UK and Britain and Ireland's larger moths. We had distribution maps for all species, distribution trends, abundance trends, and phenology charts. And so if you haven't got a copy of the Atlas of Britain and Ireland's larger moths, although I'm the lead author, I do highly recommend it. It's an absolutely fantastic resource, and the number of times in the past I used to think, oh, I could really do with something that's got all the information I need in one place pretty much for moths, and this is now is my go-to. And obviously it was published in 2019, included records up to 2016. So, you know, we are, again, you know, moths move around the country, they're expanding their ranges, they're declining their ranges. So an update to the atlas is definitely on the cards in future years. And then more recently, moving on 2022 to 2023, we received funding from the Heritage Lottery Fund and the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport for supporting science. So the whole idea of this project was to support the county recorder network. The workload has increased massively. County recorders needed our help. So we produced a county recorder toolkit, which is a one-stop shop for county recorders to get the help and support that they need. And we also made improvements to the iRecord platform to make it better for verifiers. And we also worked with the Field Studies Council and ran iRecord and iRecord verification training to help expand the network and also, you know, establish teams. And we've recruited about 18 verification assistants in the past year, and that's just for moths. There's much more for butterflies as well. And we also ran ID training as well for beginners. So it's all been really busy. And then obviously as well, we published a derived data set of the National Moth Recording Scheme on the NBN Atlas. And I checked yesterday, there's been nearly 14,000 downloads of the data on the NBN Atlas since 2003, and 40% of that use has been for education and research. So the data on the NBN Atlas also feeds through to GBIF, which is the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And I checked yesterday, there's been 85 citations of National Moth Recording Scheme data, which is fabulous. And the data have been published in 20 peer-reviewed, the work has been published in 20 peer-reviewed journals, which is absolutely fantastic. And that's in addition to the other publications and the other scientific research that the moth data are used for. So your records inform all that we and many others do, our conservation partners do. So be that from local nature reserve use up to landscape scale conservation, regional, national conservation and research, right up to global. You know, these data now on GBIF are being used by the global community and to help inform nature conservation and climate change and find out answers to all the things that are happening in the world with regarding nature and Lepidoptera, etc. So I'd just like to take this final opportunity to say thank you all. Thank you to the county moth recorders, the verification assistants, the moth recording community, our project partners, conservationists, researchers, funders, supporters and photographers, and to you for listening. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Zoe. That's great. Very thorough roundup and of the project as a whole and where we're at the moment. So that's great. So and well done for almost keeping to time. No, yeah, no, we're pretty much bang on time, which is great. So I will move us along though. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A, but I'll let you deal with those separately, Zoe, if you may, if you will, and I will move us along to our next speaker. So Dr Norman Lowe, County Moth Recorder in Breconshire in Wales, has joined us kindly. Welcome, Norman, and he's going to talk to us about Clearwings, this fantastic group of moths. Over to you, Norman.
Thank you, Richard. Now then, what am I doing?
So if you can go to share.
Useful, isn't it?
It's doing something. Yeah, perfect. Away you go.
Off we go. Right, I'm going to talk to you about clearwings, but I'm going to start actually with something entirely different. I'm going to start with a butterfly, what I call a flagship species, because it attracts lots and lots of people to recording butterflies and being interested in them. Unfortunately, moths, not so much. Some of the moths that we are interested in aren't quite so pretty and attractive as the Red Admiral. This is one of my favorite moths. It's local to this area. It's right at the edge of its range, and I see it every spring. But I have to tell you that it isn't quite as attractive as the Red Admiral. We don't have quite so many flagship species for moths as we do butterflies. And I think one of the reasons is that most of them are quite difficult to identify and quite small. But there are some flagship species already, such as the elephant hawk moth, which I think is a very good flagship species for moths, but it flies at night. Would it be a good idea to have a flagship species that flew during the day? Well, how about perhaps clearwings? Unfortunately, they are elusive things. I started being interested in moths in 1959. It took me 20 years before I saw my first clearwing. Even though I'd seen them in the books and whetted my appetite, they looked really interesting and attractive, but I could not find them. So, my slow progress in finding clearwings. After 20 years nearly, 1977, I moved to Wales, to Pembrokeshire, and found thrift clearwing. And 10 years later, nearly, I moved to Breconshire, my vice county now, and found the lunar hornet moth, which I bred from larva on salix. So a long story about how I got that larva, but let's move on. 10 years later, 1997, six-belted clearwing in Glamorgan. And then I came across pheromones and used what I call the tea bag method, hanging them up on branches in their little nets. And I found one success, which is white-barred clearwing, but that was in England. So really, I'd almost given up by then. I thought, everybody said Norman's pheromones don't work, which is rather sad, I think. But then, in 2020, the British Journal of Entomology and Natural History came up with an idea or a published article about using traps and pheromones. And I thought, maybe, just maybe, I might be successful. So I got myself 7 lures and 3 traps and gave it a go. But as well as the lures and the traps, you need to have the right time of year, the right time of day, sunny weather, and the right habitat. And mixing all those together is quite complicated and quite difficult. But I tried it anyway. Was I successful? Yes, I was. In my garden, would you believe, after all that time, I had yellow-legged clearwing, and there it is. It was considered new to VC42 then at the time, but we found out later on there was a historic record from some years ago. But nevertheless, it was new to my garden, certainly, and I was very pleased to get it. That's a really attractive moth, I think. What else? Did we get anything else? Any other species then? Well, yes, we did. Lunar hornet moth was also found in that year, 2021. And that was also found in my garden, but this particular one isn't in my garden, it's a nature reserve nearby. So I think we were doing quite well. By the end of the 2021 season, we had got 3 recorders, 11 positive clearwing records, 3 species, including the red-tipped clearwing, which is new to VC42, completely new, and 20 moths. However, of those 3 recorders, I have to tell you that one of them has recently died, Keith Noble. I'd like to pay a tribute to Keith, who's been a real supporter of ours. He died just a fortnight ago, and he'd be sadly missed. But that was 2021. We had made a start. What I did was to tell all my friends in the Brecknock Moth group about this, and they came along and said, can we, and me too, they said, can we join in? And of course, it costs money, but never mind, they said they would join in. But as it happens, a funder emerged. Brecon Beacons National Park Community Nature Recovery Grant Scheme, which is a scheme for providing small amounts of money really, with very limited bureaucracy. So all you do is put your little application in, and with any luck, you get your money. And we did. We got our money quite nicely. We had an anonymous donor as well. and that meant that we had 8 participants compared to 3 the previous year, 51 lures and 10 traps. So there's quite a resource going out there to see if we can get more species. So that was 2022. How do we get on in 2023? Well, 70 clearing records, 7 species, current clearing new to VC42, confirmed. That's slightly complicated, that we weren't quite sure whether it had yellow leg clearing or current clearing, because the two are quite similar. And the one current clearing record that I'd put down was in my garden. I saw it briefly and thought it was a current clearing, but I'm not quite sure it was now. It might have been a yellow leg, because I get them both in my garden. So I scrubbed that record altogether, as you have to do when it's doubtful. We also had 6 micromoth species as a bycatch. That was a bit of a surprise. We didn't expect to get micros coming into our clearing moth traps, but they did. And that was a big surprise, and some quite interesting records. We also, as part of the scheme, as part of the project, we had outreach events to bring people in. And it did. People came in off the street almost to our outreach events, and were captivated by the clearings that they saw in the little traps. One thing I should mention as well at this point, clearings in traps, you've got to worry about their well-being. We're very careful to make sure that we don't take large numbers of moths, and we also allow them to release them quickly so that they don't suffer. So we had 3 outreach events, and 8 more recorders were signed up for the following year. And the Brecon Beacons National Park came up and said, Norman, that was really good. Would you like some more funding for next year as well? So I said, yes, please. So that was 2022. And oh yes, the bycatch surprises. 2 little moths that we were really interested in, Trioxamira fulvomyrtella and Trioxamasia caprimulgella, came to our traps. The second one, we almost had the first record for Wales. By a few days, somebody else gone before him to Morgan, but never mind, it was still a valuable record, and a rare moth. Still not quite sure why they come to pheromones for clearings, but they do, and let's record them. So we are. We had a repeat grant. Now they're called Banau Brycheiniog rather than Brecon Beacons, just to emphasise the Welshness of the place, which I quite support. We found that the lures from the previous years were still attractive, still useful, so they were still going. And now we had 21 clearing recorders and 1 new species, the red-belted clearwing. So when you get a completely new moth in your trap, the first thing to do is to panic and think, I've got to get a photograph of this thing. Particularly with something like the red belter, which is very similar to the large red belter, so we did need to get a decent photograph. The first thing to do is take a photograph of some kind. There's my very first record of red belter clearwing, very first photograph, straight after I'd caught it. You might think it's not a very good picture, but better have some kind of record than not at all. So you do that, and you try to see if you can get something better later on. Was I successful? Yep, I was. There's a better photograph of red belter clearwing, just posing for the camera. We had only two records of this. I think it's probably at the very edge of its range. And I wonder if that's possibly because the reason why we were finding it in a different location than what we expected. We thought we'd find red-belted clearwing in orchards. And we looked in orchards, never found a single one. But when we do find them, they seem to be associated with hedgerow crab apples, for whatever reason. I don't know if other people find the same. So they asked me again, and I said, yes, please, for 2024. And so we got a repeat grant, another one, with 10 more people receiving lures. And the lures were still active even after 3 years. So I tried this 2021, the 2022, 2023 lures in 2024 and found that they were still working. So that meant that your lures will last a good long time as long as you look after them and keep them in the freezer and all the things that you're taught to do. We thought for 2024 we'd try something different as well and look for some of the rarer species that have only found some distance away, things like the raspberry clearwing and the hornet moth. But we were unsuccessful, but we thought it was worth trying. Here's an overhead slide of the looking for the hornet moth. There's beside poplars. And we used the hornet moth lure. And what did we attract? We attracted lunar hornet moth. And there's one you can see just trying to come into the trap. It was interesting that day. You see the sun shining and the moths flying around quite happily. But later on, the sun went in, and the rain came down, and the wind blew. And the lunar hornet moth was still desperately trying to get to the lure. It's really persistent, is this one. So I find this particularly attractive. We felt sorry for it. We put the traps away straight away. And that's year we were very successful with white barred clearwing. This is a rare and declining species, one of the only one, in fact, on the Butterfly Conservation list of rare and declining species that we have in our county. And we did manage to find it. And that is a typical typical habitat for the species, what we call Ross pasture in Wales. And you can see that it's acid grassland with wet acid grassland with small alder trees around. So this is what we found overall. Apart from Welsh clearwing, which is something that attracts tourists to come and look for it, and we have large numbers of records in the county. There were very few records of clearwings before 2021, before we started with the traps and the lures. 2 records of lunar hornet moth, 2 of white barred clearwing, 1 of yellow-legged, and 2 of six-belted. That's all. But in 2021, we managed to get quite a few more. We got another 11. And in 2022, 2023, and 2024, very large numbers, particularly of lunar hornet moth and of the yellow-legged clearwing. So we thought we've really made quite a dent in the difficult task of recording clearwings. So what do we find in our area for the various species that we found? Lunar hornet moth, widespread and common, active in the mornings only. Frankly, it seems not to get quite tired by lunchtime, go back to bed. But you get a few records in the afternoon, but not many. It's easily seen approaching the trap, which is a very attractive thing to see. And it's persistent, as I said, it'll even fly sometimes in the wind and the rain. The Welsh clearwing is the next species, very local, lots of records because it attracts people to look for it, but very local indeed in our county, and only recently found, in fact. White barred clearwing, associated with alder on Ross pasture. This one's easily seen approaching the trap because of its white bars on its antennae. It's very, very attractive and very pleasant to see flying around, the white bars flapping in the wind. This one was the red-tipped clearwing, which was apparently common in England, but we find it quite local and scarce. Very attractive, though. The red-belted clearwing, as I say, I think is right on the edge of its range with us, and it's very scarce, but I'm going to try looking for it again this year if I can find more of them. And as I said, associated with hedgerow crabapples, not orchards. The yellow-head clearwing is surprisingly common. It's supposed to be rare in Wales, and again, right on the edge of its range, but not so, I think. Almost everybody recorded a yellow-legged clearwing, and the one reason for that is because it's got such a long flight period from June to the end of August. Right through to the very end of August, August the 30th, we've had a record of yellow-legged clearwing. And with the great help of our local record centre, we produced maps. That's the map for the yellow-legged clearwing in BC 42 and nearby. And as you can see, it's very widespread. Seems to be particularly associated with the lower levels of the river valleys, but looking at that. And the currant clearwing, again, surprisingly scarce. We went to pick your own farms with currants and not found it at all. But we've had a few records of it. That's supposed to be common in England. We thought there'd be larger numbers than we found. And the last one is six-belted clearwing. This one is associated with common birdsfoot trefoil on stony soils. This seems like a hot microclimate. And we find it in limestone quarries and on forest footpaths where there's stony footpaths, where there's a common birdsfoot trefoil. It's interesting, this one, because it comes very quickly to the trap, but it doesn't go in. It seems to get bored and fly away. So if you hang your trap up there and walk away and come back again, it's gone. What you've got to do is put the trap on the ground and wait for them to come and find you. And they do very quickly. So, raising the profile of moths. Our outreach demonstration days were and training days were very popular and brought people in to look for clearwings. Each year of our project, new recorders joined. 30 people recorded clearwings, and all but 3 had never before seen one of these moths. The numbers are quite interesting. Before we started, 3 people had seen clearwings in the county. When we finished, 30 people had done so, out of a population of only 30,000. So I think that's pretty good coverage for our little, our fairly large, normal-sized county, but small number of people. Charismatic moths, I call them. Well, why should I say that? I looked at the dictionary definition of charismatic: charming, appealing, attractive, and influential. And I think they just about fit the bill. Charming. I think that's charming. It's like a little jewel climbing up your finger. And they do come to your finger if you ask them to. They seem to quite like it. There's another one. Appealing. This lady came to our house and was quite interested, but I said, would you like to see one close up? So we got a lunar hornet moth, which was in the trap at the time, put on her finger. And she found that appealing. She went away with the trap and lures, of course. But that's appealing to anybody, I think. Children, of course, find it very interesting to have something that looks like a hornet on their finger, but it's attractive. I think that's one of my most attractive photographs of clearwings. They're like clearing in my garden. That's an attractive moth, I think. And influential. Well, why do you think that's influential? That's because I took the trap and lure to one of our funders, put in their garden in Brecon in the town, and hung it on a tree in her garden. And within minutes, along came a lunar hornet moth to say hello. And that, I think, helped to influence her to continue to support us and give us more funding. So it's goodbye from him. I think if he could speak, he would say, nobody knew I existed in this county before this survey took place, and now they do. I think that's a good way to finish. So it's goodbye from him, and it's goodbye from me. Thank you very much.
That's excellent. Thanks very much, Norman. Yeah, wow. I need to come up to Breconshire because yellow-legged is the one that I can't get around here. I've been trying for a couple of years. Can't see yellow-legged clearwing for love nor money. But there we go.
Are you trying in the afternoon? You got to try in the afternoon, not the morning.
Yeah, I think I've been doing that. But anyway, I'll have another go this year. Well, thanks for that. That was really good. We've had one question for you in the Q&A, and some people have been talking about this in the chat as well, but I'll see. You won't have had a chance to look at that, so I'll see what your view is. But the question is, how long do pheromone lures last if they're kept in the freezer when not in use?
We don't know, because as far as I'm concerned, all of the ones we've had since 2021 are still active. So I think we can certainly say 3 years. I tried, as I said, side by side, well, sequentially, to look for lunar hornet moth in my garden with the 2021, the 2022, and the 2023, and they're all still active in 2024. So I think if you look after the pheromones, they will still last you for 3 years, at least.
Yeah. Okay. I think that fits with what people are saying. I did see one. Yeah. So there's a comment. 2020 lures still active in 2024. I think there was a older one. Yeah. So Guy Meredith says, if you keep your pheromone lures in airtight containers in a freezer, they can last for many years. At least some of a set of Clearwing lures I bought in 2003 still work, although maybe not as effectively as originally. I guess you never know how effective they are. That's part of the problem. But if you get some response, then obviously they are having an effect. I also posted in the chat that you touched upon, of course, the fact that you get unexpected moths responding to these lures, and some of those can also be quite scarce and unusual species, to make good records. And there are some lists of those non-target species on the ALS website, so I've posted the link in the chat for that as well. So what else have we got? Someone has asked, how much do the lures and traps cost? Where can they be purchased from?
Well, that's easy. The lures are about just under £9 each. And the traps, there are two sizes, but the small ones work very well. They're around about £15 or a little bit less each. And they, as you say, they come from Anglian Lepidopterist supplies. I'm sure other people supply them as well, but I've always had mine from Anglian.
Yeah, okay. There's also a question that says, does this apply to other pheromone lures, e.g. plum moth? I'm not sure what that, I don't know what that's referring to, whether that's talking about how long they last if you keep them in a freezer. Don't know.
I don't know. I've not tried that.
Okay, great. That looks like that's the questions done. So, so thanks very much for that, Norman. Very insightful and a very successful recording project, as you say. You know, these things many of these species are greatly under recorded, and just shows what an impact you can have in a short space of time. So, thank you very much. So we're going to have a short break now, and we're slightly ahead of schedule, which is great. So the next talk will start at 11:05. 11:05. Yeah, we will go quiet. In fact, we're just going to test out the next talk, but give you all a chance to go and get a cup of tea, stretch your legs, get away from the screen for a moment. Okay, see you at 11:05. Right, welcome back, everyone. Hope you got a chance to stretch your legs. We've got some technical problems. Almost inevitable, isn't it, that there'll be some technical problems, but then as Russell rightly pointed out at the start, had we been holding this meeting in person, then probably half the speakers and audience would never have made it to the meeting because of all of the transport impacts of the storm. So we're going to shuffle the program around a little bit, and we're going to go next to Dr. Luke Evans, actually formerly of the University of Reading, now Butterfly Conservation, but talking about work that he did previously. And Luke's going to tell us about trying to find the real links between moth populations and populations of birds and bats that feed upon them. So, Luke, over to you, please.
Okay. Can you see everything?
It's just
Slides?
starting.
Is it
There we go. It's happening.
just slowly?
Yes.
Well, I'll just start.
Slowly.
Okay.
Yeah, great. Thanks.
There we
Luke.
go. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm Luke Evans. Yeah, formerly of University of Reading, recently joined Butterfly Conservation. And I'm going to talk to you about some work I did with the Druid project, which is looking at the drivers and repercussions of UK insect decline. And we're interested in this question of, is insect change impacting bird and bat populations? And moths will feature, but I'll talk also generally about other insects as well. So I'll probably telling you things you already know, but many species are in decline in the UK and across the globe. So I've just on the right here got this figure from the State of Nature that is showing the kind of declines in abundance and distribution we see for many different taxa in the UK. You know, we've got a picture of the turtle dove there, obviously showing precipitous declines in recent decades. And then on the left here, I've got a kind of it's an image from a meta-analysis that's been conducted, sort of synthesizing trends of insects across the globe. And I say the globe, it's sort of biased towards Europe and the US. But it's when we take this kind of average of what's going on with insect populations, we come on this kind of decline of 1% figure. So a decline of 1% year on year. An average, some are doing better than that, some are doing a lot worse. But that seems to be the kind of figure people have measured. And that doesn't sound like too much, but when you stack that together over a few decades, you can have quite a big impact on the population. We've got a kind of just a figure down here of a kind of 1% rate and a 2% rate. So if we're somewhere in between that, when you have many years with that kind of decline, it can sort of almost kind of halve the population from what it was originally. So we know we've got these declines, and the kind of research we're doing with Druid was to ask, what are the kind of wider repercussions of these insect declines, and are they kind of propagating through into higher trophic levels? So are they impacting birds and bats directly? So we can ask a quite precise question: are insect declines a primary cause of the declines we see in other species as well? And there's good reason to expect this. We know there's insectivorous bird and bat species, for example, many other insectivorous species too. And even of those ones we don't consider to be insectivorous, birds, for example, there often is a component of insects in the diet. So there's some work here from a Nature paper looking at the adaptation of the hummingbird, obviously not a UK species, but how hummingbirds have jaws adapted to catching insects. So even with species where we think they'd be not so reliant on insects, they form a component of the diet. And we've also seen some really suggestive patterns of declines in birds that not as well studied in bats. So most of the evidence is coming from birds at the moment, one of the most well studied taxa. But this kind of picture I've got on the left here is a study done in the Netherlands where they've looked at the effect of neonics, so insecticides, on bird populations, and we see that as the kind of the concentration in the area builds up, there's more negative declines in the bird populations, and that's obviously expected to be driven by its impact on the insect food. We also have this work from Diana Barron in the UK looking at European declines, and we see declines in a number of different bird species, and particularly in the insectivores. They're some of the ones that are declining the most. Again, suggestive that declining insects may have a key role here in explaining what's going on. So can we kind of test this a bit more thoroughly, a bit more directly? And so that's what we try to do. We're working in the UK, which is, I've said, probably the best population monitoring data in the world. I just don't know how to exactly define best, but it's really up there. So we've got a number of different standardized monitoring schemes that are measuring populations. UK BMS, the Rothamsted Light Trap Network, EA monitoring freshwater inverts. There's the Environmental Change Network, a sequence of sites where we're measuring different trends of various species, and also we have that data for also the higher trophic levels, so the bird breeding survey and the National Bat Monitoring Program, and all these data sources collected over decades can provide us with these kind of indices of abundance. So we've got on the right here, we've got a kind of trajectory for one of the butterfly species, a population change over time at the kind of national scale. But we also have this at kind of local scales too. And this map at the bottom is just showing some of the coverage from the UK BMS at the kind of 5K scale. So we've got really good UK coverage measuring different populations. There's that opportunity to test if there's an association between these things. And here's some of the potential tests you could do, and we do in some more recent research I've been leading. But I'm highlighting the relationship between blue tits and moths here. And this is the kind of thing with these kind of figures on the right, is the kind of patterns of data we're looking to analyze. So we're looking to compare the abundance trajectories of that higher trophic level with the insects. So that might be the bird species and the moths in the area, or to kind of correlate the changes in those two. So if we saw a kind of connection with those two things, we'd think there's good evidence there that one's driving the other. But just to bring, it's never that easy. So just to bring up some issues with this, looking at just these correlations in the trends that we might see. This is kind of what I've called the observational data conundrum. So this is the correlation does not equal causation problem. I'm sure people will be aware of. So here on the left, we've got just this website that kind of generates these nonsense. It's really strong associations basically by data dredging. So here's a relationship between the consumption of margarine and the divorce rate. Okay, and it's a really strong correlation. Obviously, no connection there other than you can get these random correlations that occur. On the right, we've got something more interesting, which is a kind of textbook example of correlation causation gone wrong, where we've got an association between the kind of ice cream sales and shark attacks. Okay, so and I'm going to use this example to talk through how we do the kind of analysis I do when we kind of look at the links between everts and inverts. So we're going to bring in this idea of causal diagrams. So it's something I work on a bit, but I think they're a useful tool just to visualize what's going on. So we have variables in these circles, so the things we're measuring, and then we've got arrows represent causes. So in this ice cream sales and shark thing, we might be quite naive and say that ice cream sales are the causal effect driving shark attacks. Maybe they're attracted by the ice cream and then they attack people. Now, I'm not a marine biologist, but that's quite implausible. But the data is consistent with that interpretation. So we can have essentially the same data. The data looks exactly the same, but we can have this kind of spurious idea about what's actually going on in the system. And then we've got a true one here. And the idea here in this true representation is they're both driven by weather. Okay, so people more likely to go in the sea when it's nice weather, and are more likely to buy ice cream. And so that other factor is driving that association, but that's not seen in the data. And basically, if we have this kind of structure where we have these arrows and this what they call the backdoor path at the bottom here that connects up two variables, we will see correlations in them even if they're not connected, or not directly connected, not causally connected. And so this is the kind of constant thing I work with, very kind of painful situation we work in ecologies, that it's always like this when we work with observational data, when we're taking data of populations, and rather than it being one thing that might be driving two patterns, it's lots of stuff all the time that is changing. So we have situations where we're interested in variables X effect on Y. Maybe that's some kind of management strategy or a grazing regime, for example, on the abundance of a particular butterfly or moth. But that changes at the same time with land structure. Say it's more likely to be grazed in a particular way if it's on a kind of slope, and that itself might have impacts on what we're trying to measure. So we have these kind of backdoor paths where everything's changing all the time, that makes it hard to separate out a direct from an indirect or a confounded effect, we'd call it. So this is the constant thing we kind of wrestle with. And just to give you insight into like how you can try and break this stuff, one is a controlled experiment. And this is how the way this system works is we manipulate X. So we in a controlled experiment, we randomly select what X is going to be, and then we break this backdoor path between X and Y, between lots of other stuff that could be driving both X and Y. And then the effect we measure is just the impact of X. So there's ways where you can use these diagrams, just introduce them very quickly in a kind of abstract way, but they're a way to think about how to conduct an analysis that can help you isolate the effect you're most interested in. And if anyone wants to look more into this, it isn't a technique that's coming in frequently into ecology, used much more often now. There's this book, The Book of Why, that gets kind of nice introduction, popular science introductions into these sort of techniques. And yeah, you can, if you understand these graphs, they've got a fancy name. They're called directed acyclic graphs, so you can tell your friends you know what they are. And it's a really useful approach to kind of thinking about analysis. So the kind of key problem I was dealing with when trying to understand are insects driving changes in vertebrates is telling between these two systems. So is it just that they are both responding to changing habitat composition in the same way? It's bad for both of them when we change the habitat, so there's parallel declines in both the birds, say for example, and the moth species, or is it that there's a direct effect, and maybe they're probably both suffering from some changes to habitat composition or climate change, but also there is a direct effect where declines in insects can be having a knock-on impact on the insectivores. So this is some of the work we did, and we come to moths. You got through the all that analysis stuff, and we get to moths now. So this is some work we did where we kind of taking this issue and this structure and try and use the UK data to see if changes in moths are impacting blue tits. So we chose this system because blue tits are highly reliant on moth larvae during a particular, you know, as they're rearing their young. They take huge numbers of them, and so we could try and see by linking up the kind of moth data we have to the blue tit data, does changes in moths impact blue tits? We did this, so we used the Rothamsted light trap network where they have these kind of population time series. We use this approach of aggregating them within a radius. So if we have a bird site, we take a 5K area and we'd grab any moth data from in there and we'd kind of do a weighted average that would give us the moth food index that those blue tits were able to predate. And so that gave us these kind of time series over time for each site. And then we tried to find a kind of analytic strategy that could help us separate out, are these things responding just to the same drivers, or is the impact of moths having an impact on the blue tit? And so we came up with this, and this is a kind of subtle thing. It's also not a perfect solution, but it's what we came up with in this paper. And what we did was we compared how the kind of yearly change in bird populations after accounting for other factors, how that compared to how the moths changed that year. So that's kind of explanation one. And we would expect to see a high correlation here if they were just responding to the same variables each year. So if it's that kind of driven by other stuff pattern, we'd expect a strong correlation there. If it was driven by the moth abundance, so their availability of food, pattern two, we should see a correlation with how the birds are changing each year with the mean moth abundance that year. And we see a stronger correlation. So we've got pattern two. And so this is the kind of how it looks in one of these diagrams. Lots of stuff impacting both insects and insectivores as one. And number two was a driver of change is the moth abundance. And we see a stronger pattern there. So it's not a perfect test. We're trying to be creative, trying to work out how to tease these things apart. But it seems like a good year for moths is leading to increases in the blue tit populations at local levels. And then I've got a variety of figures here just to show you kind of where the analysis went. Not going to go into too much detail here, obviously, because of time. But we've got a kind of figure here. After we control for some stuff, we've got the bird population change on the Y here. Hopefully you can see my cursor on the Y here, and then the annual moth abundance that year on the X, and we see a strong correlation there between them. So birds are doing better when it's a good year for the moths. And we also were able to pick out individual species by running kind of models where we tested each species one by one, and we could pick out. There's a risk here of trying loads of different comparisons, and random stuff comes out as being important, like I kind of showed with that earlier correlation. But we were picking out species we thought would be important. For example, the winter moth came out as being a species where there was significant evidence of an association, and that's this top figure here, a top left orange one. Noisy, but typically when the winter moth's doing well, the blue tit populations are doing well as well. Okay, so concluding that one, based on some assumptions, these kind of assumptions about how we can control for these different factors, we found evidence that increased moth abundance led to increased blue tit populations. We couldn't fully separate out all the other things that are impacting both populations, both species, but moth abundance does seem to be likely to be important. And it also indicates that we can use this kind of national data to test impacts on insectivores. So I'm just going to briefly go into how we've extended the analysis. So do we find this for other species? So testing more species, insectivorous species with moths, but also using data from other insect groups. And we've done a kind of much more comprehensive analysis here, which don't have time to go into. We've tried a few new tricks, basically, to try and separate out these effects and measure the thing we think we're measuring. And we've paired it at different scales. So this is just giving you a kind of overview of how this might work. So we've got across OS grid squares, we've generated indices of abundance for the higher trophic levels. So this is the blue tit and the moth index. And so we've got these kind of time series where we can compare together and run tests to see if one is connected to the other. This is an example with the common pipistrelle and an index of abundance for Diptera. So this is aquatic Diptera. And you can see some of the differences here come from the length of the kind of quality of the data, the length of the time series we've got, and how spatially contiguous the data is. So there are some differences between these groups. And some really early results. We see essentially trends. Many of the species we looked at were stable. The blue tit was declining on average across our squares, interestingly. But one of the key things was that we generated these measures of food for, like I just showed, at these different scales, and across nearly all scales, the insect food available for these species was declining. So that's one of the kind of main things we've seen is even if we aren't seeing an effect, there's the food available for these species does seem to be going down and down. And we also find some evidence of some early links. So we're linking up. We find evidence. I haven't got a figure to show you yet, but the blue tit and the moth we find association. Great tit and moths we find association, and with Diptera and the Dorbenton's bats. So not all the species show any evidence of an impact of insect change, but we got a handful that do, or three that do. So to conclude that, we've got some evidence of direct impacts of insect change, but on kind of relatively few insectivorous species at the moment. It can be hard, even in these species, to separate out, all the complexity of the environment from the direct effect of insect change. And insect food is likely declining, but potentially one of many stressors, rather than the main stressor driving changes in these species. And so, in terms of what's most plausible, this kind of one on the left, where there's maybe a direct effect of insect change, but habitat change or climate change is probably the dominant thing. And these other sort of explanations where it's a direct effect of insects, or there's no effect of insects, are probably less likely. And I just raised, I'm not going to go into these figures, but this is just other people's work, and this is an open question that people are still working on. So there's a range of evidence accumulating, try and understand how insect change is impacting birds, bats, fish, higher trophic levels in general. And there's much more work to be done. We're kind of only at the beginning of understanding how to try and do these analyses. And so watch the space. Okay, thank you. Hopefully I haven't gone too long or too short there. I can't see a clock, but I'll stop sharing.
It's great. Thank you very much, Luke. There's a lot to get our heads around there, but some really important key messages. So thank you very much for that. I posted a link to your blue tit and moth paper in the chat, so people can read that in greater detail at their leisure. So we have got a few questions. Mike asks, where did you get moth larval abundance data from? But I think it was probably adult data you were using. Is that right?
Yeah. So this is one of the fun, one of the list of kind of assumptions and limitations that goes on with this kind of research. We use the data from the adults. So when I've got this so annoying situation where for the moths, I really want data on the larval forms, so we have to use the adults. For the freshwater inverts, so the measurements I have are kind of Diptera larvae, but I want the adults. So in both cases, I've got the wrong life stage to try and compare to the high trophic level. It's perverse. So what we found is the kind of way we get around that is we can test the measure of this year and last year, and there's going to be a connection between the larval abundance of one of those two. That's the way we try and do it. And it's going to be not as direct as we want, but it still seems to work, measuring the adults.
Great. This is more for a sort of speculative comment, really, because it's not directly stuff that you've covered in the research you presented. So Guy asks, does insectivore/omnivore abundance artificially raised by many people feeding birds in their garden have an impact on insect abundance? So that's looking at a downward trophic. effect rather than an upward one.
Yeah, that's right. You can imagine a situation where the supplementary feeding is supporting a kind of population that's too high, and then they can smash the moths down, or in the case of blue tits. I think there's been some work looking in that effect, that kind of top down, bottom up thing. But it's not something I've looked at. But I think it's a really interesting question that are we kind of sustaining these populations to where they might be the kind of reverse causation. They're making the insects go down more in the local area. I think it's a good point.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, someone else has made the same point in the chat as well, actually. So Tim asks, do you test for time lags in the effects of moth abundance on birds? And can you separate adult survival and nestling productivity or survival?
Yeah, so we tested lags, both in the research. We shared the link of it, and this more recent research we tested lags of a year, and it seems like the current year tended to have a stronger association than the previous year, but it's one of those things, like I said, where we're using some index of probably what we want is the larval stuff, and it's whatever's closest to that is probably going to be the better measure. There's an argument that, thinking about it, that the lag would be better because you might be able to kind of separate out environmental change shared in a year from the actual abundance, potentially, just thinking on the fly there. So it's a good idea. In terms of the separating out population change and things from productivity, so that's an approach other researchers have taken, is to they've had more detail. I've sort of had counts of birds, using the bird breeding survey. So you kind of have a rough measure of population change, but you can look in a lot more detail, and people have done it looking at sort of the number of chicks reared versus the food availability. And then you're more likely to kind of pick out or find the association because it's a bit more direct to, the feeding. So people have done that. I haven't done that, but that's I think a stronger link is kind of nestling survival and things like that. Yeah.
Okay. And then time for another one or two, probably. Simon asks, is the 5 kilometre radius for blue tits arbitrary, or does it relate to their foraging range?
It was somewhat arbitrary, somewhat informed by a kind of foraging range, also informed by how many sites you can do that match up. Loads of decision tree points on these kind of analyses, which is why with the more recent one, I've done it across multiple scales to try and see the robustness of this kind of results when you take these kind of different aggregations rather than taking just one value. And there's probably also biological kind of data versus biological trade-offs. So, I mean, we probably want to get closer, but then, you get less overlap. So you get more statistical power if you kind of broaden them out because you've got more comparisons, but then they're more noisy. So you can't quite win. So that was kind of a middle thing we settled on. And in this more recent research, we do it across scales to just see, we don't understand what this is going to have. We can see across, are the results consistent? Yeah.
Right. Okay. And then I think it's fitting we should finish on this one, although I don't expect a thorough answer from you. But this is from Harry in the chat. I think we're all wondering if there's a link between blue tit abundance and shark attacks.
Yeah. I think that's more research needed.
More research needed. Brilliant.
Yeah,
okay. Well, that'll keep you busy, Luke, for another few years. Great. Well, thanks very much for that. It's a complicated. Certainly analytically, it's a very complicated situation, and you did a really good job of clarifying and explaining the key stuff to us. So thanks very much for that. Right, we are going to try now. So we're going to have David Hill next. I hope. David, can you speak to us?
Can you hear this?
Yes, brilliant.
Woohoo!
Gosh, well, largely unbeknownst to everyone else, we've been battling for about an hour. David's been battling for about an hour to get into the meeting in a way that we can actually hear him. Zoe is going to share your slides. Thank you, Zoe. So let's just get that up to full screen. Perfect. Right. I will. So David is going to have to communicate with Zoe to move the slides along. So it's going to be a bit of a flashback to those great Chris Whitty COVID seminars on the television with next slide, please, kind of stuff. But we're really grateful to David for his persistence in beating the technical problems and joining us this morning. I'm really looking forward to some stunning examples of moths from the west coast of Scotland. Over to you, David.
Thanks very much, Richard. Right, let's hope after all this that the talk proves to be worth it. Well, for anyone who doesn't know me, I'm David Hill, and I work for butterfly conservation in Scotland in our conservation team. And today I'm going to talk a bit about a couple of moth species that I've been surveying for on the west coast of Scotland in the last couple of years. A couple of fairly spectacular species. The first one's on the screen now, which is Inania funebris, or the white-spotted sable. Zoe, could I get you to do next slide, please? Thank you. Well, white-spotted sable's a fairly scarce species in the UK. It's found in parts of Kent and Cumbria and South Wales. It's also found in parts of Scotland. And so the map here shows where the literature says that white-spotted sable can be found in Scotland. Could I get you to press next, please, Zoe? Oh, sorry, back one. Yeah, that's it. Perfect. Yeah, sorry, I've got a few animations, Zoe, so might be a bit of troubleshooting. So the bits that have come up here on the screen are these 4 areas. We can't actually find any mention of where the moth has been seen in these areas. So despite the fact that it appears in literature, we don't actually have any records or specific places. And these are huge bits of land, huge counties. And when we really drill into the records, next slide, please. These are the only places where we actually have a record for white-spotted sable moth. And they're really just concentrated around 2 glens in one part of Argyll. So these are Glen Etive and Glen Creran. Glen Creran is probably most famous for Lepidopterus for Glass Drum National Nature Reserve, a very well-known place to come and see checkered skipper and pearl-bordered fritillary butterflies. And that's actually where the vast majority of our white-spotted sable records come from. And that's because people come up to see checkered skipper and at the same time of year happen to see white-spotted sable. Next slide, please. Could you move on a couple just to bring the text up? Thank you. So one question we have is, these glens in this part of Scotland are quite popular. A lot of people visit Glen Etive, for example. So why do we not receive more records of this moth? How can such a distinctive thing go so unnoticed? Well, it is quite small. It's only a couple of centimeters in width, but also, next slide, please. It has a habit, or so my colleagues in England and Wales tell me, of hiding under leaves, particularly when the weather isn't so great. And any of you who might know Argyll a little bit will be able to agree that the weather in Argyll can be quite unpredictable and very changeable. So it's perhaps not always the easiest moth to go out and find and detect. So that might be why we don't get so many records of it. Next slide, please. So this is the infamous Wayleave at Glass Drum. This is where everybody comes to see checkered skipper. And the vast majority of our records of white-spotted sable in the whole of Scotland come from this very spot. Next slide, please. The moth relies on this plant, which is goldenrod, these yellow spikes. It's the only larval food plant that the moth has. Goldenrod in Scotland is not uncommon. It's not the commonest plant. It's fairly local. It rarely occurs in large numbers though, but it is found in quite a lot of different habitats, woodlands, and on mountainsides and in the uplands. Next slide, please. Here is a larva feeding on goldenrod. So in discussions with colleagues in Wales and in England, they said that the larvae are not too difficult to find. So given the vagaries of Argyll's weather, and that we really wanted to try and establish what the status of this moth is in Scotland now. It's a priority species for butterfly conservation. It's one of the species that features in our current strategy. So we really wanted to be able to determine how is this moth doing in Scotland? What's the status of it? So I thought larval surveys are the way to go because of the problems with the Argyll weather. So next slide, please. So back in 2023, I set myself the challenge of visiting all the known sites in Argyll to see if I could confirm presence of caterpillars. The moth flies between May and July. We didn't have any records of caterpillars in Scotland at all. So trying to identify the larval period, I thought, let's try early August. That might seem about right. So I set out for 3 long days of surveys. Can you flick on a little bit, Zoe? Thank you. And one more. So 3 long days of surveying got me a whole 1 caterpillar. And I found that caterpillar on the first morning. So the next 2.5 days were quite long and fruitless. Next slide, please. This was the sole caterpillar that I found. So they hide under goldenrod leaves and feed below, making these little feeding holes. Next slide, please. I was finding an awful lot of this, which feeding damage that had gone brown, perhaps indicating that, well, given the fact that I was not finding many larvae, I assumed I was just too late. Being a single brooded moth in Scotland, this meant I basically had to wait a year before I could try again. Next slide, please. However, it wasn't a completely fruitless effort. I did kind of get a really good feeling as to what the habitats were, because all the places I went, the habitat was very similar. They were all within kind of classic West Coast Atlantic oakwoods or their remnants. Generally, the sites were where goldenrod was, were beside tracks and paths, where there was a bit of disturbance, or within some of the glades. Most of the goldenrod was partially or lightly shaded, and goldenrod tended to be scarce, but when I was finding it, there tended to be a lot of that feeding damage. So I thought I was onto a good thing, nailed down the habitat, I found where the goldenrod was. I just need to come back at a better time of year and find the caterpillars. Next slide, please. So 2024, let's try again. Early August didn't work, so how about mid-July? Can you flick on a little bit, Zoe? And that was better, much better. In the 3 survey days that it took to go around the sites again, I found 30 caterpillars this time. So progress. Next slide, please. So back to the map. The dots in green were where I successfully relocated caterpillars at known sites. Sites in white, I looked, but again, I think I was actually a little bit too late still, despite last summer being fairly abysmal. A lot of species seem to be a little bit ahead in their flight seasons last summer, possibly due to the mild spring. And then those orange dots were just places I happened to stop where I knew there was goldenrod, and I found larvae. So they are potentially new sites for the moth. So again, all seem to be good progress. Next slide, please. I found most of my caterpillars at one site, that's Glen National Nature Reserve. A really nice place where you can see lots of really nice butterflies and moths like checkered skipper. And this is where the most goldenrod was, and this is where I found the most caterpillars. So I was getting quite confident at this point. I felt like I really nailed down what I was looking for, and able to find them with ease. Next slide. So this was the first site that Anania white-spotted sable hadn't been recorded at before, but I found a larva on goldenrod. So as you can see, it was not the most beautiful location in the world. It was a pile of aggregate next to a forestry track with some dumped wire next to it. And it certainly wasn't classic Atlantic West Coast oakwood. Next slide, please. That was the caterpillar I found. but it wasn't too far away from being oakwood, so I didn't think too much of it. Next slide, please. However, this was when I started to worry. So this was at the end of the last day of surveying. I was leaving Glenetive. If anyone knows Glenetive, as you kind of head up and out the glen, it's a long drive. And as you go up the glen, it becomes a lot more mountainous and the altitude increases. The trees all disappear and it becomes a kind of almost a bit of a barren landscape. And I found a larva on some goldenrod growing on the side of a ditch next to a large area of bog. Certainly not that nice Atlantic oakwood that I was assuming was the habitat for this moth in Scotland. A very exposed place, a place that is very common in the west of Scotland. We have lots of habitats like this. So if the moth can survive there, why isn't it a lot more common on the west coast of Scotland? Next slide, please. And this is when I started to worry about this species. So this is another species of Anania called Anania terrialis. It also feeds on goldenrod, and it is present in Argyll. There are scattered records up the west coast, including some around Glenetive. So roughly in the same areas as our white-spotted sable moth. Now, the moth itself looks completely different to white-spotted sable. It's this dull, dusky brown color rather than being beautiful black and whites of white-spotted sable. But the caterpillars look very similar. George, my colleague in Wales, has a theory that the heads of the caterpillars are slightly more speckled on one of the species than the other, and that might be a way to tell the difference. But we don't have definitive evidence that that's always works as an identification method. It's also thought that this moth, Anania terrialis, the caterpillars feed with more silk and with more silk on the leaves, and that they may frequent the flowers more often than the leaves. All the caterpillars I found were on the leaves and there wasn't much silk. But I am worried about whether some of the caterpillars I've been finding might be this species. So after 2 years of effort, am I much further forward? Well, I don't know. Next slide, please. So really, there's a few things we need to do to try and make some better progress here if we're going to carry on with this method of surveying. We really need to work out if the caterpillars can be identified as species. So I'm trying to rear some at the moment. It's ongoing over the winter, so I'll hopefully know in the spring if I've been successful. I am going to try this coming year adult surveys. We'll just have to take my chances with the weather and hope that I can find some. I suspect that the moth is living at quite low densities, but I will try. And also later in the summer, I'm going to look specifically for Anania terrialis caterpillars to see if the theories hold about them having more silk evident and whether they're largely feeding in the flowers or not. So I'm going to have to seek out some specific locations where Anania terrialis is. It's a moth we don't know a lot about in Scotland. So yeah, some things to find out, but maybe a little bit of progress. And of course, as you can see in the photo there, it was lovely to spend some time in wonderful parts of Scotland. Next slide, please. So the second moth I'm going to talk about is a complete change. This is a macro moth and a spectacular one, possibly my favorite moth. And this is the transparent burnet. So this is a moth that we're focusing on as part of a large project in Scotland called Species on the Edge. And through Species on the Edge, we're trying to really make some progress on some of our butterfly and moth species in Scotland on the coasts, do some conservation work and find out a lot more about the moths and the condition of their habitats. So next slide, please. Transparent burnet. So there's 4 species of quite rare burnet moths on the west coast of Scotland. Slender Scotch burnet is one, New Forest burnet's another. Transparent burnet is probably the commonest of the 4, or most widespread of the 4, shall I say. It was previously found in Wales, but hasn't been seen there for about 60 odd years. It's also present on the west coast of Ireland, but the only places for the moth in the UK now are on the west coast of Scotland. And despite the fact this is a beautiful, large moth, it's very distinctive, we hardly get any records of this species at all. Next slide, please. So a bit of a background about the moth. It's quite easy to identify because unlike the other burnets, it doesn't have spots. It has these 3 red stripes. The caterpillars feed on wild thyme. It flies in kind of June time and a little bit into July. And it's got this wonderful flight where it just bumbles along like a bumblebee. It's not like a 6-spot burnet which dives around very quickly. It's just this slow bumbling flight, almost a bit dopey. It's just a wonderful species. It's easily found even in poor weather because it just has this habit of just sitting around on grass stems. It doesn't hide away, it just sits around and gets bedraggled in the rain. And the key thing for it is that the colonies are usually found in areas of basalt rock, usually on sloping south-facing ground. So this is, next slide please, this is a classic kind of habitat on the west coast of Scotland, where you have these kind of bare rock faces with basalt exposed, steep slopes, thyme growing over the rocks. The bare rock we think is really important at keeping the habitats warm enough so that the moth is suitable, so that the moth's able to survive. Next slide, please. This is a distribution of where transparent burnets are found on the west coast of Scotland. So you can see they're on some of the islands like Mull and Skye, some of the smaller islands too, but there's also some colonies on the mainland. But it's generally very, very coastal. Next slide, please. So over the last summer or so, I've been focusing on some of these sites on the mainland, which aren't too far from where I live. So the town in the kind of middle of the circle, the top middle of the circle, is Oban. And there's maybe about 15 colonies around the Oban area. Some of these we have, so there's numbers on the screen if you can see them. So some of them, and that's the last time we had a record from those sites. So some of them we'd seen fairly recently, but some, the moth hadn't been seen at some of these sites since the 1980s and 1970s. Next slide, please. It's a moth we do have some concerns about. This is one of the sites on Mull that has been completely taken over by creeping Cotoneaster all over the rocks and all over the short grassland that the moth loves. Next. And this is another problem. This is bracken. So with warming temperatures and just more nutrients around, bracken has been doing really well in the west coast of Scotland and is moving into habitats that didn't used to be present in, like this, where transparent burnet used to be found. Next slide, please. So I'm really just going to talk about an example of one survey that I did last summer. It was just such a spectacular day for me. So this is a map of Oban. That's literally Oban town centre at the top of the map. So Oban is one of the most popular places to visit on the west coast. It's one of the larger towns. You get the ferry there to all the islands, so it's a very popular place. In the 1970s, a local man recorded transparent burnet on the hill, and he collected some moths. And I don't know if he ever told anyone about them, but 30, 40 years later, his collection came to light. And the previous moth recorder for Argyll, a chap called Andrew Masterman, discovered this collection, and he went and refound the moth on this hill, literally just on the edge of Oban. And that's those cluster of dots that you can see, the orange dots. He visited those that site over 2 or 3 years and consistently recorded the moth there. So I thought, well, it's not been seen there for 6 years. That's where I'll head first. So next slide, please. And when I got there, I was faced with this. It was overgrown, it was mossy, there was hardly any bare rock, couldn't find any thyme. I knew I was in exactly the right spot, and my heart immediately sank. This wasn't suitable for the moth at all. Was this already a lost site, the first one I've looked at? Next slide. But I didn't give up. I thought I'll just head along the ridge a bit and see if there's any other habitat. And I found this area and thought, well, there's some there's a bit of bare rock on these slopes. Let's have a look. And sure enough, next slide, there was one moth. I looked quite hard and I could only find the one. But it was still present, so that was great. Next slide, please. And then I walked along to this little spot here. And you can't really see, but off the right-hand side of the picture is a really steep drop. And the scale doesn't really come across, but it's quite a significant rock face. And there's a lot of wildflowers in there. And I just stood on top of this knoll at first. And I looked down, and all these transparent burnets were walking up grass stems as the sun started to come out. And the grass was just alive around me. Next slide, please. It was just, the grassland was just full of these wildflowers and thyme and transparent burnets everywhere. Next slide. There was mating pairs. It was just one of those wonderful experiences you very occasionally get in wildlife, where just everything seems to just come alive around you and you're the only person there. And yeah, it was one of those wonderful moments. Next slide. And yeah, if you can just skip a couple along, some red. Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. So as I went along the ridge, I found transparent burnet at all these sites where I put the red dots. So that was over about, well, almost a kilometre of the hill. I was finding transparent burnets in breeding habitat. And I almost couldn't believe this, because this is such a obvious moth. And here we are, 10-minute walk outside of Oban Town Centre, and nobody's ever recorded these. I was just, I couldn't believe it. But it just really goes to show what you can still find when you go out and look in the right places. Next slide, please. So this is my final slide, and this just shows the progress we've made so far with transparent burnet. There's an awful long way to go, but the blue dots represent where we've refound the moth in the last couple of years. There's still quite a lot of dots we need to visit this year, and we've just very recently appointed a trainee in Scotland who is going to try and visit some of these sites for us, and hopefully we'll have a much better handle on how this moth is doing on the west coast of Scotland. And that is me. Thank you very much.
That's great, David. Thank you very much. So on that, just on that last map, then there were red dots and blue dots. Which way round were they?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So red dots are old records, and blue dots were the records from the last year or two.
Okay. So the red ones were the places that you're going to try and hit in the coming months or years. Yeah. Great. Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Fantastic talk. Beautiful species. We don't have any questions. So everyone's obviously just kind of, floated away on a little tranquil ride of enjoyment, looking at those beautiful moths and caterpillars, and hearing about your the trials and tribulations of trying to record them. So there are a couple of questions that have now come in, so we'll just deal with those quickly and then we'll have a break. So Ellie asks, will there be volunteering opportunities relating to that kind of survey work?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a project officer on Species on the Edge called Liz Peel. So if you get in touch with Liz, so you should be able to find her details on our website. Look at Species on the Edge, or if you get in touch with me, we can pass that on, and Liz should be able to put you onto which sites you might want to survey. That's for transparent burnet, or you can get in touch with me and I'll help for the white spotted sable. Okay,
that's great. And then Carol asks, when was transparent burnet last seen on Skye? I spend a lot of time there and could look.
Yeah, so it was seen this year because we appointed a contractor to visit sites for another burnet, Talisman burnet, and the two species occur on the same bits of ground. So we've got some records of transparent burnet from some of those areas, but there's lots of other bits of Skye where we haven't seen the moth for quite a while. So we could, certainly send you those details if you're interested in looking for them.
Great. That's great. Thank you very much, David, and particularly for your persistence in getting to join us today. That was really, really good.
Thanks,
so Thank you. We're going to have another quick break now, chance to get away from the screen just for a few minutes. So we're going to start again. The next talk will be Dr. Sam Fabian. Is going to start at about 12:05. So if you can be back for 12:05, that would be great. Thank you. Right, well, it's 12:05. So I'm going to keep us to time. Again, hope you've had a chance to get away from the screen. It's great to see all these fantastic talks, but it's also good to stretch and move about from time to time. So we've got two more talks in this year's UK Moth Recorders Meeting, both kind of connected to light and the issues and the whole sort of topic around moths and their attraction to light. And so we're going to start with Dr. Sam Fabian from Imperial College London. So thanks very much, Sam, for joining us, and I'll pass straight over to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, no, it's my pleasure to be here. I'm just sharing my screen. Can I just check that you can now see my first slide?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me and for the fantastic talks that have been up until now. My real kind of field and what I work on is how insects in general fly, and trying to understand the different kind of functionalities. And I think there's a really key thing that I think absolutely all of you will be aware of, which is that flight and light have something to do with each other, especially when it comes to flying in the dark. So we can have both in a laboratory setting and in a field setting, but it's really well known, and every single one of you will know, that insects aggregate around bright light sources. And this is something that we can actually find the Romans puzzling about, and you can find people writing about defending their bees and their kind of apiaries using lights in the Roman Empire. And so we've had thousands of years of observation that if you have a big bright light source at night, these insects come and might crash into it or get stuck. But the flight that we see around this is making the insects look as though they're trapped. And so they appear stuck. And so I think the real question to this research project is, what is actually the functional cause of this common behavior? And there are lots of ideas out there, but it was really trying to nail down what is the sort of behavioral mechanism. So a single response that we can explain all of these different insects getting stuck around light, and that includes moths. So there are really two schools of thought from extant hypotheses that are out there. And that's that you have direct attraction. They see this light as a gap in the foliage, and they're really trying to head for a gap in the foliage to get away from something very scary or a sort of confusion. There's the idea that it might be attraction to thermal radiation of lights. We actually know that's not true now, because we can have as many bright LED bulbs and they will just attract various insects in the same way, provided their wavelengths, their colors are matched to what attracts those specific insects. LEDs work just the same as an incandescent bulb. So that tells us not thermal radiation, because the LED is not chucking out nearly as much heat, and yet you still get the insects. There's indirect attraction, and that's something that I think a lot of you who've spent lots of time around lights at night or seen insects coming into lights will have this kind of indirect attraction idea that you don't really tend to see. Okay, the occasional insect is coming straight out the darkness and crashing onto your screen, but quite often when they're around the light, they're flying in circles, or there seems to be some sort of looping pattern in that. And so a really common theory, and the one that you'll hear most often expounded, is that it's put in fancy language here, subversion of the celestial compass. What that means really is that it's something to do with the moon or other lunar lights, or other kind of sky-based light sources, and that the moths and other insects might be trying to use these as a compass cue, and they'll try to head at a kind of fixed direction with respect to something like the moon, and that'll help them travel in a straight line if you're traveling over long distances. And we definitely know that insects do use celestial compass cues. That's not in debate, but the question is, are they getting confused around artificial light sources and treating those as though they're the moon and traveling at a fixed angle relative to them, leading to these kind of spirals? And I'll come on to talk more about that later. And then there's a really fun theory here, which has some of the most exciting experiments I've ever seen, which is the zone of confusion. And that's that in the visual structures of things like the insect eye, if you have a really bright light source, the area around it is sort of made darker by way of contrast. And that dark area might be what the moth is actually aiming for, or the other insect might be aiming for. They're aiming for that dark region that they can see around the light because of a property of their eye. But I picked that one particularly because the experiments that were done in the 70s, before they had high-speed cameras that could work pretty much, in infrared or in the dark, they had moths attached to tiny little styrofoam boats that are then floating on oil pools, which have electrical conductivity to work out where those boats are. And they were floating and had these little moths piloting little styrofoam boats around to try and understand it. So we've got these different theories, but what you actually really have is a paucity of data. And that's because at night it's quite dark. And these moths, these other flying insects, they're traveling really, really fast. All right, in actual terms, they're traveling quite slowly. They're traveling not much more faster than you might jog or you might run, but they're so small. And that's the real problem here, is that you've got very small objects that are moving very fast proportional to their size. And that makes them very hard to record. And also it makes it very hard to see in those dark environments. So the first way in which we set about asking some of these questions is to use modern, kind of very modern technology, which is called motion capture. And so I could make these little frames which are 3D printed, and then I'm attaching. You can just see on this left, on this noctua, there are 3 little markers there, and each one of those is a retroreflector. So it works much like a cat's eye in a road, or a real cat's eye, and it will preferentially bounce light back along the axis that it was sent out. And so you'll see them as really bright spots if you have a light near your eyes. Now, this has been attached to the moth's back with a tiny bit of resin. That is actually a reversible process, and I realize it's lost some scales, but this is the moth is, as far as I can tell, not particularly suffering in this instance, and we can remove them and release the moths afterwards, which is something I quite like to do, even though it's not strictly necessary. But we have these markers, and then we have the camera system. So we have these motion capture cameras that have these big ring lights around them. And these are working in infrared. So they're shining infrared lights right next to the camera lens. And then you have these little markers on the backs of the insects that reflect the infrared light back to the origin. And so we can see tiny little infrared dots where our moths are. And we can actually see multiple dots per moth. And what that means is that we can not only tell where that moth is, but we can tell what angle its body is in space while it's flying around. And we can do this at a very fast rate. This is exactly the same technology as is used in everything from, it was really pioneered by Weta Workshops when they were working on Gollum and a lot of early kind of CGI work, but now it's used in the video game industry. It's also used in a lot of so biological research into flight and in biomechanics, the mechanics of how bodies work. And so I could have 8 of these cameras in a big ring in the lab to kind of create coverage at high resolution and really, really, really fine resolution. So I can tell where each of those markers is to a precision of about 1/4 of a millimeter in space. And so we set about really trying to work out what does the flight around the light actually look like, and get some quantitative, some data-driven recordings of this to start testing these different extent hypotheses. So let's start with this direct attraction. Do we see evidence of real, like what we might think of as straight lines? Nocturnal insects might be using escape response or simply being directly attracted to the light. And so I'll show you here 2 insects flying around the light in the lab. And so this is a big artificial screen that we have behind, which is meant to sort of mimic a natural horizon. And on the right is something that we don't tend to get a lot of in the UK, but is night flying moth, the Atlas moth. This is a male, and he is doing a very classic moth thing at a light. He's flying in an almost perfect circle around and around. Now, rather confusingly, on the left, I've got a dragonfly, and it's funny because we don't generally associate dragonflies as coming to light traps. But if you chat to friends in the tropics where they have a lot more dusk flying dragonflies, you actually do get dragonflies coming to moth traps and light-based moth traps in the tropics a lot. And you can get them in the UK. It's just much more rare. This is the common darter. That's a totally diurnal, totally day-active animal. And yet it is being trapped and going around and around the light in a very similar fashion to the moth. And so it might be that these nocturnal insects, there's nothing actually special about them and why they get stuck at lights. The reason you don't see so many day-active insects at the lights is probably just that they're asleep. They're not the ones flying around and getting stuck at the lights. But to link this back to this direct attraction question, we don't really get much in the way of evidence of insects flying directly to the light source. And I should stress that this is within a few meters of the light. We actually have a very poor idea of what's happening at tens of meters or even, half a kilometer away from a light. But certainly at close ranges, they seem to have this kind of circuitous path rather than flying directly to the light. And so these are 3D reconstructions of the path of the insects. And you can see here that both of them are really orbiting the light. And that's a true orbit, which I'll come on to explain what I mean by true orbit. But they are going around and around. They're not flying directly into the light. These are very capable flying insects. If they wanted to, for want of a better term, they could fly and land directly on that lamp, but they don't. So here are the different insects that was particularly focused on the lab. I've got 2 different sizes of dragonfly as a kind of example of diurnal animals that we don't expect, we don't tend to think of being attracted to light. And then 2 moth species in the noctuid and the ascus, 2 very different sizes of moth. And these are the kind of 3D flight tracks, but we're looking just from the top down. So they're really fixed on the 2D plane. So you're looking from above, and that light is always at the center. What you're seeing is a real dominance of this circular trajectory around the light. And there very, very rarely do we actually see sort of what you might think of radial spokes. We're looking at bike tires here, but not the spokes of the bike tire. They're not coming straight into the light. And so I think that's really arguing that there's something different from direct attraction, that these insects aren't seeing that as somewhere to go, but something's going a bit wrong in their flight system, and they're causing them to get stuck in loops. And you can imagine in the wild, if they crash or if there's a wall or there's anything like that, they're going to crash into it and get stuck as they're circling around it. And that's why if you have a light on a wall, you tend to get lots of insects around that light. It tends to be that they've kind of got confused and hit the wall as they're going around it rather than flying directly at that surface. So this requires just a little bit of explanation. It's the same data but transformed. And so it looks like there's a lot on there, but it's a relatively simple diagram, which is explained in the top left in that gray portion, where each one of the animals has a direction in which it's heading. And we've just plotted that relative to where the light source is. So in this case, the light source is always at the top of the page. And then we've got the insect. And where you're seeing the kind of darker bars on each of those colors, that's where the insects tend to travel. And so in all of those cases, in the 4 kind of colored examples in the middle of the page, you can see they're really clustering around 90 degrees. And that's what makes this a true orbit, in the same way that the moon is almost always traveling at 90 degrees relative to the Earth. The Earth is 90 degrees relative to the sun. That's an orbit. You are traveling an almost perfect circle. And that's a really, really dominant feature in lab conditions. And I'll come on to talk about non-lab conditions later. And then on the right, you can see that as soon as we switch that light off, actually that real concentration disappears. So it's not that our enclosure itself is forcing them to go into the circle, which would be something that could happen. But it really seems that as soon as you have that light on, they're traveling in a sort of almost perfect circle around that light. And different insects have slightly different patterns of circling, but it's a really strong dominant effect in these larger insects like the dragonflies and the moths. But could this match an indirect hypothesis? And that's the lunar compass model. And this is one that you'll find in biology textbooks, and you'll find argued a lot, even though we don't have very good data to support it. But we do know that insects do use kind of things like the direction of the Milky Way or other what we call celestial sky-based sources of light as compass cues. And the idea is given on the right, that if you're using the moon or the sun, that is an effectively infinitely distant source of light. As you move along and you're driving along in your car, if you look at the sun and you carry on a straight line, the sun's going to stay in pretty much the same place. It's moving by about 15 degrees an hour, of course, as the Earth turns. And so you need to kind of account for that using some sort of time compensation. But you could use that to travel in a straight line. If you always travel at roughly a fixed bearing from the moon, you're going to travel in a pretty straight line. But that doesn't happen if you've got an artificial light source. And that's a bit like driving along in your car and then trying to travel at a fixed angle relative to a lamppost. That's going to be a very different effect. And that's because the distance between you and your lamppost is completely different relative to your speed than you and the moon. Your relative translation, your movement moves that. And so you're going to end up spiraling around it. And so this has been the kind of dominant theory for a long time, that these insects are using this lunar compass. And this is This could explain some of the circular trajectories, although it's confusing that we get this real dominance of 90 degrees. But it could also be an averaging effect that on average, if you take angles between 0 and 180, you will on average have about 90 degrees. But is there some way in which we could more fundamentally test this? And this was something I was really struggling with for quite a while. But I came up with what I think is quite a simple way to test this amongst a few others. And that's that if you have two lights, and you switch just one of them on, that's what's happening here, and you have an insect, a moth in this case, that's orbiting that light. It's going around in a circle. In this case, say it's going anti-clockwise. If we switch on the next light and we basically swap them, we should expect that that insect should orbit in the same direction. Again, it should be going anti-clockwise around that light. And that's because if you're using a compass cue, you want to keep it in the same sort of region and travel at a fixed angle relative to it. And so say if you're traveling with the sun on your right, and then there's something a bit confusing, and then we switch on the new light, you should still want to travel with the sun on your right to continue traveling in the straight line. And so do we see that? Do we see that sort of bias that they stick orbiting in the same direction overnight, suggesting that they want to be traveling on a sort of geographical area? They want to continue traveling in a straight line. So these are some experiments I did in my back garden, and this is not a moth, but actually a butterfly. It works just as well on butterflies, but I tested it on some noctuids as well. And so here we can see that this moth is going in an anti-clockwise direction. Swap the light, and all of a sudden that moth is, butterfly in this instance, has gone in a clockwise direction. And at random, they will swap which way they orbit around lights. That is the exact opposite of what we should really expect for a compass cue. Your compass should stay on one side or the other. And so that is arguing, this swap in direction is arguing against it being a purely compass cue, especially at close ranges. Again, we don't know what's happening over longer ranges, but could it be something else? And there's a really fundamental property of light even at night. That's that the sky is almost always a brighter visual field than the ground. And the ground is especially poor at reflecting things like UV. And we know that UV is particularly attractive to insects or brings more insects and traps more insects. And there's something we've known about definitely in insects for about 70 years, and we've known about it in fish and marine invertebrates. And it's called the dorsal light response. Insects that are in an unstable flight posture, say if they get blown or there's a sudden gust of wind, well, they'll maneuver themselves so that the bright visual field, which is always the sky, is above them. They'll tilt their backs towards the sky, assuming that the sky is, the bright area. And we know about this in various different insects. And we know about this particularly in day active insects. But could it also be a factor in night flying insects? Because even at night, it doesn't really matter how dark it is. The sky is always still going to be brighter than the ground. The contrast is still there, even if the actual light level is much, much lower. And this is actually driven by not only the compound eye, but insects are actually running a second visual system, the ocelli, which not all moths have, but some moths will definitely have those as well. They have a second visual system that is also a component of it, purely driving this response to keep the sky above. And that's the same as in a plane. The most important thing for a pilot is to know which way is up. It's important that they know other things, and I would encourage them to learn other things first, but that's a really important thing to learn and to be able to measure at any one time. And insects and fish and marine invertebrates that might be in the air and experiencing all kinds of accelerations, they use the direction of light to work out which way is up. Now, what happens if we start introducing artificial lights? Well, there we could theorize, and this was the theory we were developing, is that you have this bright light over to one side in a place that it would never normally be. It's away from the sky. It might even be from below. And the insects in a stable flight posture will then tilt themselves over towards that really bright light that's so dominating. And that tilting would create flight effects. So you'd see the insects are flying around, and then as they get tilted by this light, they get confused as to which way is up. And that could cause changes in the speed in the same way that if you tilt an aircraft or you tilt a drone, that's going to cause it to kind of start circling. Think about tilting a helicopter. That's how helicopters get around. They tilt themselves. It moves the force around, and then that causes them to start this spiral. So what we did is to take this imaginary, what's called the dorsal axis, this imaginary line that projects out the back of the animal, and then map that onto the ground. And then we also mapped out the direction to the actual light source. And if this were true, if they're tilting their backs towards the light, we should see what we call the direction of dorsal tilt. The direction in which they're tilting their backs should point towards the light source. Do we see that correlation? And we see it unbelievably clearly. clearly in each of these animals. So along the x-axis in each of these, along the bottom axis is the direction to the light source, and along the y-axis is the direction at which those animals were tilting their backs. You can see a really strong one-to-one correlation in all of these. They are tilting their backs towards that light in the lab, and as soon as we switch that light off, which is on the right in the gray, we see that effect disappear. Okay, but it's all very well saying that this interesting stuff happens in the lab. We've got this really solid theory that works in the lab. What if it's just an artifact in the lab? And so that's where I was working with my colleague, Dr. Yash Sondi here, and we were out in the forest of Costa Rica, trying to record as many different insects flying around the lights and seeing if this kind of common idea that they're tilting their backs towards the light, they're getting confused as to which way is up. Is that leading to all of the effects we saw? And so the effects that we saw in the field, we could survey a much wider variety of different insects, included what we call different behavioral motifs, just different patterns that we see in the behavior. You can just sort of scribble down. It's not very quantitative in this instance. But here you're seeing stalling. So this is a little hawk moth, well, quite a big hawk moth actually, who is flying up and just sort of stopping in the air. It looks like it's running out of speed and stalling. That's quite an unusual thing for an insect to do. We saw orbiting, and so that's the same as what we saw in the lab, but we don't see nearly as much in the field. And that's probably because there's air movement in the field in a way that there isn't in the lab. That any amount of wind is kind of knocking the insects out of this stable flight pattern. And so we see that on windy nights, we saw no orbiting. It was only on the very still nights did we see this pattern of going around an almost perfect circle around the light. But that's still present here. But I think probably the most convincing motif, the most convincing pattern that we observed is this. This is inverting. This is a black witch moth flying directly over a light. And I'll let it play a couple of times just to show that that moth flies along, and as soon as it flies over our upward facing light, it's flipped itself entirely upside down. That is not something this insect should be doing. That insect is then completely upside down, and actually insects can do some pretty funky maneuvers if they want to. But in this instance, we think this insect doesn't know that it's upside down and is therefore crashing straight into the ground. This is not something that it should be trying to do, and yet it is doing because we think it's confused as to which way is up. It's a very, very simple kind of idea, but it seems to be very, very strong at explaining all of these different flight effects that we're seeing. And so going back through these different motifs, we see the stalling behavior seems to be to do with what's called a pitch offset, that the animal is flying along and tilting it up, and it's not producing enough force to make that climb. And that's causing it to kind of stall out and tip onto a new flight course. We see this orbiting, and that's when they're kind of rolled in towards it. They're sort of, as in an aircraft, when it's turning, they're rolled over to one side and creating that sort of spiraling. And then we have this inverting, where they might flip themselves totally upside down. And so we have this kind of general theory, which is if you have light from above, they should be fine. And if you've got light from below, we should expect them to crash. And so do we actually see that? So we set up exactly the same bulb and sheet. If you have that light, you have that bulb set down in a sort of conventional moth trapping environment, you get these insects crashing into the sheet. And that's how you might trap insects. But if you take exactly the same sheet, exactly the same light, and have it on the ceiling, suddenly those insects aren't clustering up on the ceiling. They're flying around underneath it. Now, some interesting things happen when they get to the edge of that sheet or where they start to pull away from the light. But generally, when they're under that corridor, we don't see them flying up towards the light. So here I've got a point light source, which is like a light bulb. And on the right, I've got a light bulb that's shining up onto a big diffuse ceiling that looks more like the sky. You can see that the kind of trajectories here of these different insects that are flying around are very, very different. So you can see it's all clustering around the point light source, but this kind of more where they're able to pass underneath the light when they have this diffuse ceiling that's more like the sky. Again, sort of supporting this idea that it's to do with having sky-like illumination telling them which way is up. And then finally, we can actually start building some simulations. Now, I won't really dive into the complexities of how these simulations are built, but we can start using this model to create little fake moths that are flying around and see if they're getting trapped into lights in the same way. I think this is going to be really fun to explore lots and lots of questions we have about the different ways moths fly and other insects fly and how that might render their kind of flight performance around these lights differently and the different patterns we should expect. I won't, for time's sake, I won't dive into how that model is working. But in summary, I'd like to leave you with that these insects really tilt their dorsal axis. It's a fancy way of saying tip their backs towards bright light sources as a stabilizing reflex. Normally, in the wild, that's a great thing to do. But this behavior largely explains why they seem to do these erratic flight paths near light sources, that they're tilting their backs towards these really bright lights because they think they're upwards, and that's leading them on these really weird flight patterns. And then finally, this same effect can also steer an insect towards a light or cause it to crash and then trap it, because once they're in this confusing light environment, they don't know which way is up, and that is what's causing these insects to get stuck. There could definitely, this is not exclusory of other theories particularly, there could be other factors at play as well. This seems like a really dominant effect close up. And so there's so much we still don't know, and you can see a little brimstone butterfly going around this light bulb here in the lab. What's called spectral tuning or color tuning of the response for different insect taxa. We have good the idea of which colors you should put out in the wild if you wanted to attract different types of moth, but we don't know exactly how that's rendered in the eye or exactly what the changes are that's causing that difference. How insects actually deal with this kind of effect normally, the sun is not always directly above, sometimes it's hitting from the side, but then the sky might still be bright enough. And exactly how this response works in kind of normal conditions is another thing we don't really know. And we also don't, again, sorry, fancy language here, but basically we don't know how much they have a sense of which way is up from other senses that they might have. We have an inner ear that helps tell us which way is up and down, but insects don't have an inner ear, but they do have other structures that might tell them which way is up. And so there's a lot we don't know, and I'm looking forward to basically exploring into the future. But I'll leave it with some acknowledgements for the people who really made this work possible. I'd particularly like to highlight my colleague Yash Sondhi, who was an absolute expert on the moths of northern India, and more generally an absolute moth nut. And he's been terrific to work with, and really has driven a lot of the work here. But thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions about the work.
That's fantastic, Sam. Thank you very much. Brilliant, brilliant talk. Lovely to see all those videos and with their simulations and things on top of them as well. Really fascinating. So there are some questions. We don't have a lot of time for questions. I'll ask you a couple, and perhaps I could get you to have a look in the Q&A box and
of course, yeah,
and add some answers. So the first question from David is about you. So you mentioned about moths, some moths having ocelli and others not. So he's asking about whether you looked at that within any of your lab or indeed field studies, whether you did any kind of comparisons.
So it's something that I'm very interested in doing, because the way in which those two visual systems, those two eyes work is very different. Ocelli, those simple eyes that are on the head, they are generally out of focus. They're not forming an image, but they're really, really, really fast. And they're kind of a way in which they're being used as horizon detectors, very fast horizon detectors to correct insects in flight. And we know about that from things like dragonflies. Exactly how they're being used in moths, many moths and butterflies tend to have very, very small ocelli, or ocelli that have mostly disappeared inside the head. Whether those are still functional, we don't know. And there is a component of this that is done by the compound eye as well. And so exactly where that trade-off is and in different species, we just don't know. But I think it's going to be really exciting to find out. It's a great question.
Okay. And just one more then.
Of course.
So this is a question from Alan, and it's about, lots of moth recorders put their moth traps on white sheets, with the thinking being that for various reasons, partly so you don't tread on them and you can see them more if they settle near the trap rather than on vegetation. But so I guess, does your work say anything about whether we should be continue to use white or pale coloured sheets, or whether we should be using a dark surface around our trap? So, a dark colour that could have the same effect of making the moths that land near the trap more obvious, but to maintain that, up-down light perspective.
So if you want to trap the insect, I think using the white sheet is absolutely perfect. That's going to be the most confusing cue to them is having a really bright surface underneath them. And almost no insects that I've tested, in fact, including, I've got some videos of some flies here. If you have ultraviolet light coming from underneath, almost no flies that you can find in and around your garden will be able to fly over that. And so this is a bunch of insects flying directly over a kind of UV floor. and they crash upside down. Moths are relatively unusual in that it's not just UV. Most insects have it really strongly dominant in UV. Moths will do this to kind of what we can see with our eyes as well. But absolutely, having a big, bright, reflective sheet, as reflective as you can on the ground, is going to work very, very well for this. So I think it's twofold, that you can both see the moths, and the moths are more likely to get trapped. But we can think about this also, and I think Avalon will have more opinions than I do on this. If you want to avoid trapping insects, which much of the time we do, you might actually want to darken those surfaces and have much less scatter back up into the atmosphere, because it's going to be less confusing. But yeah.
That's great. Perfect. Thank you very much. And lots of very
pleasure.
positive comments about your talk in the chat. So feel, do have a quick look through that. So thanks very much, Sam. And so Sam's already kind of partly done my job of sort of starting to introduce Avalon, who's our next and final speaker. Delighted to have Avalon join us today. It's pretty early in the morning for Avalon, so we're particularly grateful for you, Avalon, getting up at the crack of dawn, or probably before dawn, in Eastern US to join us. So Dr. Avalon Owens is at Harvard, and is going to talk to us about moths and light pollution. Over to you, Avalon.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Great. I'm really excited to be here, early though it may be. So awesome to see so many of you interested in some of my favorite insects, the moths. So I, like Richard just said, I run a research group at the Rowland Institute at Harvard, and we're primarily interested in understanding how light pollution affects animals, mostly insects and mostly moths. Light pollution, I would argue, is one of the fastest growing environmental threats of our time. 88% of Europe, broadly defined, and 23% of the habitable land surface of the Earth is unnaturally bright at night. And our nights are only getting brighter over time, nearly twice as bright in just the past decade. So this is a huge environmental threat, and it's one of many threats to insects, especially moths. Interestingly, it's rarely mentioned as such, and that's sort of another talk entirely. But the point here is that insects do seem to be under threat from multiple directions. And I'm not sure if this graph has appeared yet today because I was asleep, but work out of the Rothamsted Insect Survey in the UK, which is one of I think the longest continuously operating insect survey in the world, has documented significant declines in the abundance of macro moths over this past, let me do some math, it's early, 50 plus years. And it's not just in the UK, there's other surveys in the Netherlands and many other places that have sparked fears of what we tend to call the insect apocalypse. This idea that there is a global decline in insect abundance and diversity. This article in the New York Times got a lot of attention back in the day for first sort of raising awareness of this phenomenon, let's say, among the general public. And I really like this article because it immediately, in the tagline, goes on to ask, what does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? You know, the things we care about. But of course, that's not our opinion, right? We're interested in what's happening to the insects themselves, especially the moths, because we care about them. And so we're not going to ask this question. Instead, I'm interested in, I would consider a much more important question: what can we do about it? As I said, there's many threats facing insects. I consider light pollution to be one of them. But what do I mean when I say that? What do we mean when we say insects are threatened by light pollution? This is sort of a complex topic. And I think going through the multiple various ways in which light pollution affects insects can give us a little bit of clarity here. So if you'll indulge me. I tend to divide the effects of light pollution on insects into 4 basic categories. So we're going to start with what I call temporal disorientation, which is this idea that artificial light can confuse an insect's sense of time, both within a day and over the course of a year. So as a very simple example, certain moths come out at certain times of night to do certain activities. So you can imagine this moth here, perhaps it likes to visit flowers at around midnight to 1 a.m. That's when the flower is open, that's when the moth is active, that's when this behavior can occur. Well, how does the moth know to get up at 11 p.m. in preparation for this behavior, right? It has an internal sense of where it is within the course of the day, what we call the internal clock. And the internal clock is responsive to external light. And so you can imagine this moth waking up at 11 p.m., seeing an artificial light, thinking, loosely defined, well, that's interesting. It seems like it's still light out. I must have got this wrong. I'll go back to sleep and wake up when it's dark. And if an area is sufficiently light polluted, it might wait to wake up forever. Sort of a grim possible future. Over the course of a year, these differences compound. And so insects use what we call day length, the length of the day, as a measure of where they are within the year. As the days get longer, they think it's summer. As the days get shorter, they think it's winter. Some leaf mining moths go through various forms over the course of the year. What we might call a summer form, which eats a lot and reproduces really quickly, many, many generations. And then a winter form, which has a very cold, hardy pupa, just ready to hang out and wait for it to get warm again. And Franz Holker's group in Germany has a really elegant study showing that a certain species of leaf mining moth uses light cues to time this decision. And so artificial light, either in a greenhouse or in an urban area, makes them think that the days are long. So they think that it's still summer or fall, and they stay in their warm weather form despite the temperature as it gets colder and colder and colder, and they will, some of them, freeze to death. So as you can see, the consequences of both of these changes in time can be pretty grim. So that's one aspect. What we tend to mostly think about when we talk about light pollution and insects is what Sam just talked about, of course, fatal attraction or flight to light behavior. And I really don't need to go into this except to say, from a conservation perspective, this isn't very good for a lot of reasons. Moths and other insects that do this might die by colliding with a light source. They might die of exhaustion, circling the light over and over and over again. They might get eaten by predators that have learned to approach lights in order to get a nice meal. But I would argue that the greatest fitness cost for this behavior is time. Moths that are at a light are not doing anything else. They're not foraging, they're not mating, they're not laying eggs. And moths don't live that long. So one lost night is pretty significant in terms of their ability to make more moths for the future. So that's fatal attraction. I would consider this to be a subset of sort of a larger problem, a larger thing that light pollution does, spatial disorientation. Light can confuse an insect's sense of where it is in space. Many insects use celestial light cues, such as the moon or the stars, to navigate the world at night, because these are, as Sam was talking about, these should be sort of constant landmarks. And there's really great work out of Marie Dack's group in Sweden on dung beetles, which have this interesting behavior where when they make a ball of dung, before they do anything with it, they crawl on top, do a little circle and look at the night sky, and then use the Milky Way as a landmark to go in a straight direction, their goal being to get their ball of dung away from the rest of the dung and everybody else as fast as possible, so they can use the stars as a cue to travel in a straight line. And so in a beautiful, pristine night sky environment, they do this very well. When there's lights on the horizon, they might actually go towards them. So a little bit of fatal attraction here. And when the sky is just generally light polluted, we have general sky glow, they become disoriented. They're not really sure which way they're going, just like if one of us closed our eyes and tried to walk in a straight line, you're not very good at it. So that's spatial disorientation. And the last thing I want to talk about, I feel, personal opinion here, is way underexplored given the potential effects of this. So visual confusion is essentially light of unnatural color makes things look different. So here's a beautiful example out of Julian Trosciano's group at the University of Exeter. This is a foxglove flower as it appears to us during the day. This is approximately what it looks like to an elephant hawk moth at night. Now here it is what it looks like to the hawk moth when it's lit up by a cool white LED. And here it is lit up by an amber LED. And all of us here are pretty smart, and we know that this is the same flower, but these extreme differences in color can make it difficult for insects to recognize many resources in their environment, not only floral resources, but host plants, prey, predators, and others of their species. And huge tangent here, but visual confusion is one of the worst things that light pollution does for fireflies. Added light makes it difficult for the fireflies to see each other. And I could talk more about this for hours, but I'll just move on. So here we have these 4 effects, these different things that light pollution can do. All of them are bad for the insect in a certain sense. And all of them are ever sort of growing more and more problematic over time. They're greater pressure over time because our light pollution levels are growing exponentially, especially within the past decade. So this recent paper from 2023 showed that using citizen science observations, that if you as a child lived in a place where you could see 250 stars in the sky at night, as an adult, a 20-something, you would be able to see less than 100. So we are very rapidly losing natural darkness. And it's hard, most people don't notice this. When you bring it up, suddenly it's very depressing. And so this article is from an issue of Science in which light pollution made the cover, which is really exciting. This was 2023. This was exactly 50 years after one of the first articles about possible negative effects of light pollution, also published in Science by this astronomer, Kurt Randle, who was worried about how it would affect observations. And I'll come back to this. So here we are thinking about light pollution with this extremely well-illuminated stock image of people staring at a night sky with very few stars visible, with all of that light pollution on the horizon. And we're all sitting there wondering, what can we do about it? So my first thought is there must be some sort of sustainable lighting practices that we could pursue. Interestingly, if you Google image sustainable lighting, this is one of the first things that comes up, images like this, talking about different types of lighting. So older lighting types like incandescent bulbs, Sam mentioned, they're quite hot. And they're losing a lot of energy as heat, and we call that sort of inefficiency because we want the light and not the heat. They also burn out really quickly, so you have to replace them often. We've had some technological advances since then. Compact fluorescents are more efficient, they last longer. And then, of course, recently we have the LED, which is super efficient. It emits a very cold light, and it also lasts a very long time, so it doesn't have to be replaced. Well, this is great. We might call this environmentally friendly lighting, and in fact, many people do. So here's something curious. This is a painting of Boston Common at twilight from 1886, and you can see around the perimeter of the park, there are these oil lamps, gas lamps, I believe, actually, going around, and these are even less efficient than incandescent bulbs. These release tons of heat, and they also have to be replaced often, so not very sustainable. Well, if you go to Boston Common at twilight today, you'll be delighted to find that it's extremely sustainable. Look at all of this environmentally friendly lighting. Most of these are LEDs. They emit a super cold light, and they're also never going to break. They're going to be here forever. Not only that, but we have these very sustainable big glass buildings with no curtains, which must be unsustainable for some reason. I haven't quite figured that out. So that all this light is released 24 hours a day. Okay, so this is not environmentally friendly, right? And noticing this, folks at Dark Sky International have come up with a different measure of sustainability, what we might call dark sky friendly lighting. This is a set of practices that aim to reduce the amount of light in the environment to the lowest possible level required. And if you're not familiar, if you're not familiar with Dark Sky International, this is the biggest group around working to limit light pollution from a policy perspective, by educating people about this problem, and by conserving the night sky in dark sky parks. If you've ever been to a dark sky park, that is because of Dark Sky International. Dark Sky International puts out these 5 principles for responsible outdoor lighting. that light should, and they're sort of in order of priority. So lights should only be on if they're needed. They should be targeted, what we also call shielded, to point only where they're needed. They should be at a low level, as dim as possible, as while still being bright enough to fulfill the needs of people. They should be controlled, loosely defined, either on timers or motion detectors. And then finally, they should be warm colored. So not as much blue, more oranges and yellows. This is for several reasons. Blue light bounces around more in the sky and creates more of that sky glow light pollution haze. And it also has certain health effects, which we could talk about. Dark Sky International works through local chapters. So I have one in Massachusetts, Dark Sky Massachusetts, which I'm a member and I really enjoy. There is Dark Sky UK, so you guys might be interested in that. Check out the group, see what they're doing. Dark Sky Massachusetts is really active in promoting local policy change. So they have these lighting ordinances that they sort of disseminate to folks at different towns and cities around Massachusetts for them to go to their local legislators and say, we want to change our public lighting in particular. And these efforts have been bounced up to the state level. So Dark Sky Massachusetts introduced this Dark Sky bill. They've actually been introducing it for 10 years now, and it's sort of been a pretty big struggle, but that's not what I want to talk about. As part of the evidence included in this bill are photos like this showing the effects of certain responsible lighting practices around Massachusetts and how nice they are. And in looking at this photo, I was struck by something. So you have an unshielded light going in all directions, and then you have targeted light down here pointing only where it's needed. This is great for making sure light doesn't go up into the sky, but arguably the insects should be hanging out around here, right? In this image, it's winter, but they should still be in this area under the light. And that got me thinking, is shielding really environmentally friendly in the way that I care about? So here's me thinking about this. And these thoughts blossomed into this paper published late last year in Current Opinion in Insect Science, which is kind of like science, slightly different. So this was an effort by me, Michael Pocock at the UK Center for Ecology and Hydrology, and Brett Seymour at the University of Texas, El Paso. And in this paper, which is publicly available, if you Google it, you can read it as much as you'd like. It goes through these 5 principles and sort of assesses each one. So the first is about color temperature, the suggestion that lights should be warm colored. So I'm sure all of you know that insects are attracted to cold colored light, especially UV, which is the shortest wavelength. I mean, we can't even see it. It's extremely short wavelength, and UV sort of turns into blue. And so around this UV blue area of the spectrum, you'll get a lot of insects coming to lights of these colors. And as you go along the spectrum, along the rainbow, and get more towards orange and red, you get fewer insects attracted to lights of those colors, such that many people say that insects can't see red, which is a bit of an oversimplification, but it is true that if you put up a red light, you won't get many moths or other insects. So that's great. But when people talk about warm colored lighting, dark sky friendly lighting, they're not talking about UV versus red. They're talking about this spectrum here, cool white on the left going to warm white on the right. And actually, they're not usually talking about this over here versus this over here. We're in the middle somewhere, whereas these are different shades of white. And people recommend limiting the amount of blue in your shade of white for sky glow reasons, and because blue is tied to the internal clock. We'll come back to this. But as far as insect attraction to light goes, different colors within this range don't seem to make a lot of difference. There have been tons of studies on this, which we review in the paper. We've been going back and forth on this for probably close to a decade, maybe over a decade now, wondering a lot about what colors of light are insect friendly. And the general conclusion is it doesn't make a huge difference. Insects are still pretty attracted to orange lights. These are mayflies, and you can see huge attraction. And we should know this, right? Because the moth to a flame, that age-old adage, fire's pretty orange, and they still go to it. Okay, so the next principle is about controls. And here I'll talk about timers. A timer is something like this on the top left, where you plug your lights in. It'll have a sensor that turns your house lights or your street lights on when it gets dark, and then turns them off at a specific time. Now, what's interesting to me is what time is that exactly? People might think midnight, 2 a.m. It's just some time at which you've gone to bed, and so you don't need the lights anymore. Those of you who've spent time at night at moth sheets know that a lot of insect activity happens pretty early on, right after twilight. You'll get a lot of insects at a sheet. However, it takes moths longer to arrive. So many moths arrive after midnight, right? So the degree to which a timer might alleviate flight to light behavior really depends on what insects you're talking about and what time you're talking about. So it's not a clear win as far as I'm concerned. And we'll talk about motion detectors more in a second, because I think that they're quite different. All right, so what about dimming? We keep our lights as dim as possible. Will that reduce their effect on insects? I stole this image from the butterfly conservation website. There's a great article called Shine a Light, How a Moth's Eyes Adapt in the Dark, talking about the fact that moths have extremely sensitive eyes, orders of magnitude more sensitive than our own. And so they see very, very dim lights as quite bright. And so when we talk about dimming our lights to make them dark sky friendly, we're usually talking about something around 5 lux, which, numbers aside, is essentially the level at which you would walk along a sidewalk and feel like you could see where you're going. And that level is going to be extremely bright to a moth. So there's a real disconnect here, such that, yes, a very, very dim light will have less impact, but humans aren't going to use that anyway. Yes, okay. So what about shielding and targeting? Strikingly, there has been extremely little research into this topic, despite the fact that it seems quite promising. So I had my original idea that shielding might not be that impactful, but there's this very cool study that just came out of Franz Holker's group in Germany, comparing these sort of just absolutely going wild, older lighting types in this public park that they're not shielded and they're illuminating everything, right? There's a lot of what we call spillover. The lights are on the grass for some reason, even though nobody's going to be walking there. And then the light is going up into the sky and in all directions. And so they replaced these lights with equally bright lights that were just shielded and targeted so that they only illuminate the sidewalk. And also, a sidebar, this is sort of the level of brightness that a human might accept, which is still way brighter than most moths might accept. However, doing this really decreases flight to light behavior a lot. The number of insects that fly to these lights is significantly lower than the number of insects that fly to these lights. So this seems like a really promising solution, but we just don't talk about it. And in fact, I would say the only things we really talk about in the field are changing the color of the light, which doesn't really work, and changing the brightness of the light, which doesn't really work. We don't talk about timers so much, and we certainly don't talk about shielding. And I'll just say the last thing that we do to have dark sky friendly lighting is turn the lights off. And this is universally effective. This is what it looks like. It's kind of hard to see because it's very dark, but this is like the control scenario, right? And so turning your lights off will always be beneficial. So to go back to the 5 principles, here I'm laying them against the 4 impacts of artificial light on insects. And the very observant among you may have noticed that almost all of the examples I gave just now were about fatal attraction, this flight to light behavior, and how to reduce that. There has been extremely little research in how to reduce the other negative impacts of light on insects. And so part of the reason that we put this paper together was try to get a little bit more research attention, both on more promising lighting principles as well as other equally important lighting impacts. And so I'm a bit out of time, but for fun, you can visit the paper and see my best guess, or say all of our best guess, as to what lighting principle best ameliorates what lighting problem. And so we draw lines between these, like, for example, changing to a warmer light probably helps with temporal disorientation a lot because blue light is involved with the internal clock, and lowering the amount of blue light can have a big impact. But anyway, there's lots of these, and it's quite a fun mental exercise, despite the fact that there's not a ton of evidence quite yet. So I'll just conclude by giving my best guess, somewhat educated, but we have a lot to learn, of insect-friendly lighting practices in order of priority. So number one, don't have lights on that you're not using, 100%. Those that you are using, if you put them on motion activators, they will only be on when people are around. That, by definition, is not light pollution. Light pollution is light that is wasted. So motion activators make it so that all the light that is on outside at night is being used by people. Shield these lights to the smallest acceptable area, dim them to the lowest acceptable intensity. These will probably be less effective, but still helpful. Filtering them to the reddest acceptable color. It is probably overall good on balance, but it could be harmful in some cases. And timers, I think, also can be harmful in some cases. I don't have time to go into why. So really, it's the top two that I think should be our greatest priority as far as what we can do individually and at a public level. So with that, many people to thank, especially my lab group and collaborators, and I'm happy to take any questions.
That's great. Thank you very much, Avalon. So do we have any questions? There are a couple of questions in the Q&A, but I think they relate more to the previous talk.
There we go.
A question about light and glowworm populations. But,
yes.
Yeah.
Let me talk. Yes.
So what do we know about that?
Yeah. Great question. There has been there is one really wonderful long-term running survey, the UK Glowworm Survey. And there's also been some work specifically asking about the effect of light pollution on glowworms in a sort of natural context. And this is really compelling. So glowworms work a little bit differently than fireflies. In glowworm species, the female is on the ground glowing continuously, and the male is flying around. He doesn't bioluminesce at all, but he looks for these points of light and approaches them. So two things can happen with artificial light. A sufficiently glowworm-colored artificial light can appear to males to be a giant female, and so you can get glowworm males aggregating at these lights instead of at the females. That's not so great. But more common is sort of illumination that the phrase that Alan Stewart and colleagues use is cuts cheese holes in the landscape. So a spot of light on an area, all of the female glowworms in that area can no longer be seen. And importantly, they don't move. They just sort of sit there and they're not going to be reproductively successful. And so you get these gaps. In the dark areas, they seem to do just fine. But the more lit area you have, the lower your reproductive success. And so that's a big concern for glowworms specifically.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. There's interest from Mark Young. Hi, Mark. Asking, so he's specifically asking for a contact for the German group working on leaf miners. So perhaps you could go into the Q&A, Avalon, and add a detail. So I've put a link to that paper in the chat while you were talking, but that's something that Mark would appreciate. There are various talks about LED, the various questions about LEDs, and so there was a question earlier about whether LEDs are worse for insects. You know, so obviously, I mean, I don't know the situation in the States, but obviously here in the UK, most of our street lights have been changed to LEDs or are in the process of being changed to LEDs, and what the impact of that is. And someone else has asked about LED car headlights and the because car headlights are much brighter. I don't think it's just that I'm getting old, although sadly that is
No,
happening. But car headlights are much brighter than they used to be. So I
I
don't
mean,
think
I
you've
might
got
be
any
getting old too,
thoughts.
but driving at night is much less fun than it used to be. So Giuliano Toscano's group also has a great study that just came out about car headlights and effects on moths specifically. So go find it. It's wonderful. LEDs generally, this is really tricky. I'm not going to sit here and say LEDs are bad because they're not environmentally friendly. Or sorry, it's not older lighting types are not environmentally friendly. LEDs are efficient, and that matters. Like the amount of energy that we're wasting, wasted energy contributes to climate change and many other problems. LEDs do tend to be just too bright, especially when they were first developed. The technology was new and it was so bright we didn't really know how to control it. Unfortunately, that's about the point when a lot of lighting manufacturers made all of their streetlights and then, had to sell them. And so we have a lot of these super bright LED streetlights around today. But LEDs don't need to be that bright. And they also, when they first came out, were very blue rich, had a lot of blue light in them. That doesn't have to be the case either. LEDs can be very warm colored and very dim and very sustainable if used wisely. We just need to spend more time thinking about brightness and what level of brightness we really want. Because one of the issues with LEDs sort of populating the earth and being so bright is that we have this rising tide phenomenon where today, if you install some nice, lovely, dim LED streetlights, all of a sudden that area looks a little sketchy. It's a little dark compared to the rest. And so there needs to be really good awareness of how it should be, how we want things to be. And LED technology is such that we can make them that way if we work together.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I'm gonna draw things to a close because we're kind of over time now. But yeah, there's a lot of discussion in the chat about how we get councils to turn off lights and that kind of thing. I think you're completely right. It's a human problem. It's a social problem. What people will accept, and quite a lot of your concluding slide was around that. How warm a color will people accept? How dim a light will be? It's all about people, isn't it? For the bulk of the audience here today who are UK based, personal experience of mine, we got the streetlights turned off in our little road by the council. So there was one right outside our house, shining straight into my son's bedroom, and we asked them to turn it off, and council said, well, if everyone in the close agrees, we'll turn the lights off. So we just spoke to the neighbours, everyone agreed. So now we have a dark sky cul-de-sac and you can see the stars. So councils are obviously very sensitive to critics and comments and hassles that they get from people, but you can use that to your advantage as well. So yeah, do talk to your council, do lobby them to make changes. Right, I'm going to draw us to a close. Thanks very much, Avalon. It was really, really good discussion and really good sort of overview of the situation. And I've posted the link to your paper in the chat as well. So yeah, thanks. So just finally then, thanks to all of the speakers who've joined us. I think it's been a really fantastic session. Thanks very much to Zoe for putting the program together. There is an evaluation form which Zoe will post in the chat just now, so it'd be great if you could fill in the evaluation form. I'm not going to do a huge amount in terms of sort of closing remarks or anything. I think there were some clear themes that kind of come through the various talks. Obviously, there's concern about ongoing declines of insects and the impacts of our activities, whether it's lighting or all sorts of other human activities on insects. There's been some clear stuff about changing technology, whether that's the use of pheromones for recording, whether it's the analysis techniques that Luke has been employing, or the cameras that Sam has been using. But the thing that most comes through to me as an avid moth enthusiast is just that whole sense of the trials, but also the rewards of recording and studying moths. You know, it's not always easy. It hasn't been easy for David Hill spending 3 days finding one caterpillar. Turns out it might not even be the right species. You know, these things aren't always easy, but boy, they're rewarding. You know, moths are fantastic. And please carry on. You know, it wasn't a great year for moths last year for moth recording. Hopefully this year will be the weather will make things easier for us moth recorders. But yeah, keep on recording, sending your records on, keep on studying, and keep on learning about these fantastic creatures. So unless there's anything else, I'm looking at Russell or Zoe. Then we will bring that to a close. Thanks everyone for coming. Hope you've really enjoyed the day.
Yeah, thanks everybody.